The Great Dividing Range was something we'd always talked about. It had this mystery to it, this raw, wild beauty that both terrified and intrigued me. It was a summer trip, and we figured we didn't need tents, just our sleeping bags and a few basic essentials. The sun was harsh, but the thought of lying under the stars, the cool air of the mountains, seemed like an adventure we couldn't pass up. It was me, Andy, and Sarah, all in our mid-20s, heading off to spend a week in the mountains. We packed light, backpacks full of food, water, and a tent fly just in case we got caught in the rain. I had been to a few spots like this before, but nothing quite like this range. The rugged peaks, the dense forest, and the open plains, each step further from civilization felt like a deeper step into another world, where nature held all the power. We drove into the foothills at the start of the hike, unloading our gear and starting off on a trail that wound through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the faint buzz of cicadas. It was beautiful, surreal, and a little intimidating. The trail was easy enough at first, a steady incline through dry, scrubby bush. The mountains looked like something out of a dream, jagged peaks that rose sharply against the sky. By midday, the heat was starting to wear on us, but we kept pushing forward, knowing that we had to cover a decent distance before we set up camp. By late afternoon, we found a good spot near a small creek, nestled between the trees. It was quiet except for the sound of water running over rocks and the constant hum of insects. The air had cooled off a little, but it was still warm enough that we didn't need jackets yet. We set up our sleeping bags on the ground, spreading them out under a large, leafy tree. The plan was to sleep open under the stars, with the tent fly set up above us as a precaution. That night, I felt a strange kind of peace. The sky was clear, the stars incredibly bright, and the forest was alive with sounds. The distant call of a kookaburra, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful. For the first few hours, we talked about our plans for the next few days, joked around, and let the warmth of the fire settle in our bones. It wasn't until later that the creeping unease set in. I felt something on my face, tickling, soft, almost as if a strand of hair had fallen across my cheek. I brushed it away, thinking it was nothing. But then there was more. Tiny, crawling sensations on my arms, my neck. I swatted at the air in annoyance, thinking it was just the aftermath of a long day of hiking, maybe a few bugs trying to take advantage of the darkness. But then I felt it again, something crawling across my neck, small but distinct. I opened my eyes, and for the first time since we'd set up camp, I actually looked around. The ground was moving, or at least it looked like it was moving. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the sleepiness. The ground was covered with something. Thousands, no, millions of them, caterpillars. They were everywhere. They moved in wriggling masses across the dirt, creeping up the tree trunks, hanging from branches. These weren't just regular caterpillars. They were large, fat, and covered in thick, fuzzy hair. I could feel my stomach turn as I saw them crawling across the open ground around us. Some of them climbing onto our sleeping bags, some getting tangled in the hems of our clothes. I wasn't sure if it was the darkness playing tricks on me, but the ground almost seemed to shift and pulse with their movement. "What the hell?" Andy muttered, his voice groggy but full of disbelief. "What is all this?" Sarah sat up and wiped her face, groaning. I could see her shake off something small from her cheek. A caterpillar, another one. It crawled across her arm before she swatted it away, but there were more coming, too many to count. I wanted to get up and do something, anything, but my limbs felt heavy, too tired to fight. So I lay there, half awake, half dreaming, peeling fuzzy, tickling things off my skin. They weren't just crawling on us. Some had already burrowed into our sleeping bags, their hairy bodies scraping against our faces, our arms, the backs of our necks. I felt the bristles of them against my skin, and every time I thought I had cleared myself of one, another would appear. I couldn't get away from it. Every few minutes, I would peel one off and toss it aside, but for every one I removed, another would take its place. It was like they were multiplying, or worse, they were waiting for the right moment to crawl over every inch of exposed skin. I could hear them crunching on the ground as they moved in clusters, an awful, constant sound that echoed through the quiet night. First, it didn't seem too bad. The caterpillars weren't venomous, at least not to humans. But the sensation of them crawling across my skin, the constant feeling of something small and fuzzy on my face, began to drive me mad. I tried not to panic, but the sensation of them multiplying under the stars was too much to ignore. My face was covered in a fine, soft fur that tickled and itched, and each time I wiped it away, I could feel them crawling up my arm, my neck, finding new spots to invade. Felt like it would never end. I kept brushing them off, but I was so tired, so tired. In the dark, I heard Sarah shift restlessly. "I can't stand it," she murmured. Her voice was tight with discomfort. "I feel like they're everywhere." I wanted to tell her I felt the same way, but my own voice was a croak, a rasp as I tried to swipe more caterpillars from my skin. At some point, I drifted back to sleep, or at least into a half-sleep, barely able to keep my eyes closed. It wasn't restful, not in the slightest, and every time I woke up, I felt them crawling over me again. I didn't know if they were still there or if it was just the memory of them that kept me on edge. By morning, I was a wreck. I'd barely slept, and the thought of staying another night in the same place made my stomach churn. The caterpillars were still there, though the morning light seemed to have driven some of them away. I could see their little bodies clinging to the trees, scattered across the ground, like some horrible living carpet of fur. I tried to ignore the feeling of them still in my hair, my skin, but it was impossible. We packed up quickly, none of us wanting to linger. The hike for the day was grueling, our nerves still raw from the previous night. We couldn't stop talking about it, but the more we discussed it, the worse it seemed. It was as if we'd all experienced the same crawling, creeping horror, but none of us had the courage to say it out loud. The thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something far worse than caterpillars hiding in those woods. Something that made us feel like we were never alone, always watched, even when the creatures weren't around. We managed to make it to a safer spot that evening, one that seemed distant enough from the caterpillar infestation. That night, there were no creatures to torment us, no crawling, no wriggling things on our skin. The sky was clear, the stars as bright as the night before, and the air cool and fresh. We slept under the open sky again, but this time, I felt a strange sense of relief. The thought of waking up to another night of that infestation was unbearable. We didn't talk much as we settled in. All of us were too tired, too on edge to care about much more than getting some real rest. By the time we finished the hike, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted. There had been no ghosts, no supernatural events, just the raw, real terror of nature. A reminder of how fragile we all are when faced with something bigger, something we couldn't control. The next day, we walked out of the range, back to the car, exhausted and grateful. As we passed through the gates and into the parking lot, I took a long, deep breath, savoring the fresh air, the lack of crawling creatures. There was a new respect for the wilderness, for the things we can't predict. The world beyond the trail may be beautiful, but it doesn't always show its hand until you're in its grip. We didn't talk much about that night afterward. We didn't need to. The memory of it was enough. The trail twisted and climbed, cutting through a dense carpet of ferns and thick underbrush. The weight of the pack on my shoulders pulled at me, but I didn't mind. It felt familiar, the pressure of it. My boots crunched against the gravel and loose rocks beneath me as I navigated the steep incline, my eyes scanning the forest around me. I'd done this plenty of times before, hiking in remote parts of Northern California. This wasn't my first time walking these trails, but that day, something felt different. I didn't know it then, but I'd soon be in a situation where familiarity wouldn't be enough to make me feel safe. My name's James, and I've spent more time than I care to admit in the wilderness. I've seen it all, the occasional bear, a couple of mountain lions in the distance, even wild boar up close, though I had the sense to back away slowly in those cases. Still, nothing had ever really scared me. Not the big animals, not the occasional close encounter. That was just part of the landscape. But that day was different. I was out on this particular trail with my friend, Mike. He's the kind of guy who likes to take risks, always pushing for something a little more remote, a little more untamed. We were far off the beaten path, deep in a section of the Redwood National Park, an area where the trees grow so tall and thick that you forget what time it is. It was a place where few people venture and even fewer locals know about. We'd been on the trail for a few hours, and I could tell Mike was eager to keep going, always itching for more adventure. The air was cool and crisp, typical for this time of year in late October, but the sun peeked through the thick canopy in patches, creating dappled pools of warmth on the forest floor. It was peaceful, almost serene, the kind of quiet that makes you forget there's a whole world outside these woods. The forest was alive in a way that was hard to explain. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't the only one out here. We hadn't come across any other hikers, which wasn't unusual. People didn't often come this far, preferring the more well-known trails. That suited us just fine. We had our sights set on a small valley a few miles ahead, a place where Mike said he'd found some great spots for fishing in the past. So we kept going, chatting off and on, with Mike leading the way. The trail narrowed as we climbed higher, the vegetation becoming thicker with every step. Then, as we crested a hill, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting behind a tree. I froze, instinctively reaching for the knife I kept on my belt, but the movement was too quick to pinpoint. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe it was just my imagination, but the feeling that something was off crept into my bones. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice lower than usual. Mike glanced back at me, a slight grin on his face. "Yeah, probably just a deer or something. Let's keep moving." But I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We continued on, and the trail began to slope downward, winding into a wide, open valley. It was different here, lighter, almost unnaturally so, like the trees were standing a little further apart, giving the land room to breathe. The ground was softer, and there was a constant sound of water running nearby. We both paused at the edge of the valley, taking in the view before moving forward. That's when I noticed it. About 20 yards ahead, the landscape changed. The thick, wild forest had given way to rows of plants, arranged meticulously in neat, parallel lines. I thought I'd seen a patch of cultivated land before, maybe a small garden, but this was something else. The plants were huge, thick, and dark green, standing out against the brown earth. At first, I didn't know what they were, but as I walked closer, the unmistakable scent hit me. It was pungent and sharp, something I'd smelled only a few times before, and I immediately realized what we were looking at. Marijuana plants. The rows stretched for what seemed like miles, disappearing into the thick forest beyond. It was an operation, an illegal grow operation, and it was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. The ground was sculpted to allow for irrigation, with pipes and hoses snaking through the soil, feeding each plant. Reservoirs filled with water sat at intervals, and above the plants, camouflaged netting draped like a web, hiding the operation from anyone who might fly overhead. My heart began to race, and a sick feeling settled in my stomach. I looked over at Mike, who was standing still, scanning the area. He hadn't said anything, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. We needed to get the hell out of here. "Let's turn back," I said quietly. Mike nodded without a word. We'd both seen enough. But as I turned to retrace our steps, a sudden crack of a branch echoed from behind us. My muscles tensed immediately. That wasn't the sound of a deer. That was a person. Someone had heard us. Someone was close. We didn't have time to think. We didn't have time to plan. We started running back the way we came, pushing through the brush, stumbling over roots and rocks. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I fought to keep moving faster. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear movement behind us. Footsteps, someone following us. The noise was faint, but it was there, and it was enough to send a chill down my spine. We had no idea how many people were out there, how many people were watching. But the thought that they were armed was too real to ignore. This wasn't some recreational grow operation. This was serious, and the people behind it wouldn't hesitate to protect their investment. Mike and I didn't speak, Not even when we broke through the trees and saw the trail ahead. We didn't have time for anything but the sound of our breathing and the pounding of our feet. Every time I heard a crack of a branch or the rustling of leaves behind me, my heart skipped a beat. Were they gaining on us? Were they already too close? We pushed ourselves harder, ignoring the cramping in my legs, the way my lungs burned. I knew that if we stopped for even a second, it could be over. We needed to get back to the car, get back to safety. That was the only thought in my mind, and it was the only thing keeping me moving. By the time we reached the top of the hill again, I could hear voices in the distance. They were muffled, but the sharpness in them made my stomach turn. We were getting closer to the parking area, closer to the relative safety of our car, but we weren't out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. My mind raced through possibilities. Would they confront us? Would they try to stop us from leaving? Mike and I didn't slow down until we reached the car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, my mind still focused on the sound of those footsteps, now gone. We didn't speak until we were both in the car, doors locked, and the engine roaring to life. We sped down the dirt road, every bump in the road reminding me that we weren't safe yet. The tension didn't ease until we hit the main highway, the dense trees giving way to the more familiar, open landscape. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? We had gotten out, barely, and that was enough. When we finally reached the town, I felt a sense of relief, but I knew that what we'd seen in that valley would never leave me. The grow operation, the fear, the feeling of being hunted, it all sat heavy on my chest. We never went back to that valley, never spoke about it again, but I knew what we'd seen was real. There are parts of the world, parts of this country, where the wilderness doesn't offer peace. Instead, it offers danger, hidden behind the trees and the leaves, and you'd better be ready to run if you ever stumble into it. And now, when I'm out on the trail, when I'm deep in the woods, I carry that lesson with me. I've seen bears and mountain lions, but the memory of that grow operation, and the people who run it, will always be the scariest thing I've ever seen. The sun was barely starting to break over the jagged peaks of the Hawaiian mountains, casting a faint orange glow on the jungle around me. I had been hiking for nearly 2 hours before the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach gave me a sudden, unmistakable warning. It was time to go. The kind of time where you don't have much choice in the matter, where the urgency is so intense that your body seems to seize up and you're just praying you'll find a bathroom in time. My legs ached from the morning's climb, and I tried not to focus too much on the stomach cramps, but the thought of the long trek back down without a bathroom stop was unbearable. I looked around the trailhead, hoping to spot anything that could offer relief, and in the distance, just at the edge of a small clearing, I saw a lone porta potty. Thank goodness. I quickened my pace, making my way toward it as fast as my tired legs would allow. The small plastic structure sat in a shadowed area off to the side of the trail, almost as though it were waiting for me. As I neared, I noticed it was a little more run down than I would have liked. The bright blue plastic had faded in places, and the smell of stale air and disinfectant wafted from the door as I approached. It was a stark contrast to the lush greenery around me, the thick trees and vines growing wild as the morning sun began to heat everything up. Reaching the porta potty, I hesitated for a second. There was something off about the place, but I pushed it aside. The urgent pressure in my abdomen made me not care about the state of the structure. I swung open the door and stepped inside, greeted by a faintly unpleasant smell. But at this point, I didn't care. The tiny space felt even smaller with the heavy air and the strange feeling of being completely surrounded by the forest outside. I quickly pulled down my pants and sat down, immediately feeling the relief that only a good bathroom break can bring. I was just finishing up when something made me pause, a slight flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. It wasn't much, but something about it caught my attention. I squinted in the dim light of the early morning, trying to figure out what it was. I'd been so focused on my business that I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, but now, something in the corner seemed off. My heart rate kicked up slightly as I shifted my gaze. It was a spider, but not just any spider. No, this one was enormous. Its body alone was about the size of a golf ball, and its legs spread wide, stretching out like a living nightmare. It was hanging near the top corner of the porta potty, near the small ventilation slot. Its massive body glistened in the weak light of my headlamp, and for a split second, I thought it was a trick of the mind. But no, there was no mistaking it. This was one of those huge, terrifying banana spiders that I'd heard about in stories but never expected to encounter. My stomach sank. There was no way I was going to stay here much longer with that thing looming above me. But I couldn't panic, not yet. I took a slow, steadying breath and tried to remain as calm as possible. I had to think clearly. The spider was already startled by my presence. I could see its legs twitching and its body shifting, as if it were deciding what to do next. I needed to get the toilet paper, finish up, and get the hell out of here. But first, I had to get around the giant 8-legged menace. I slowly reached for the toilet paper, trying to make as little noise as possible, hoping I wouldn't disturb the spider. The light from my headlamp illuminated the paper, but the moment the beam landed on the spider, it reacted. Its long legs jerked, and its body twitched violently. It was as though the sudden focus of the light made it go into full panic mode. The spider started running in wild, erratic circles, its body shaking, legs flailing. I froze. I couldn't move. My brain screamed at me to run, to get away, but I was stuck. Mid-squat, pants still around my ankles, and now facing a creature that was clearly just as freaked out as I was. In the dim, cramped space of the porta potty, the spider's frantic movements made it look even bigger, more menacing. My heart raced in my chest, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. The spider's path became erratic, darting around the tiny stall, its legs brushing against the walls and the floor. I didn't know whether it was going to attack me, crawl up my body, or just continue its panic dance. In my head, I kept chanting, "Don't move, don't move, don't move." But the thing was on a mission, and it wasn't planning on staying put for much longer. I reached for the toilet paper again, this time more quickly, but in that instant, the spider lunged. Or maybe it was more of a swift movement, it didn't matter. The result was the same. The huge arachnid was now between my legs, right underneath me, dangerously close to my underwear. I lost it. I yelped, my voice cracking in panic. I immediately started to wiggle in the hopes of shaking it off, but that only seemed to encourage the spider. Its legs brushed up against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I could feel the texture of its body against me, like something cold and alien. In that moment, all I could think about was the fact that it was so close, its legs making contact with my skin. I began shifting back and forth, twisting my body, hoping to dislodge the spider. My movements became more frantic, but the damn thing refused to leave. Instead of running away, it climbed higher, its legs now brushing against my thighs as it crawled up my leg. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright, yanking my pants up in a blind panic. In the process, I tripped over my own legs and nearly stumbled out of the porta potty. But I didn't care. I screamed at the top of my lungs, stumbling forward and dragging my pants up around my hips as I bolted out of that wretched little plastic box. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the world around me seemed to blur. I stumbled into the open air, still screaming, my heart racing so hard I thought it might explode. The cool morning breeze hit my skin, and I finally stopped, standing in the middle of the trail with my pants half-zipped and my hair wild. I looked back over my shoulder, trying to see if the spider had followed me out, but there was no sign of it. The porta potty stood there, innocent looking as ever. But I knew better. That thing was still in there, somewhere. My legs felt weak, my hands shaking as I pulled my pants up properly, taking deep, steadying breaths. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, and noticed the early morning light filtering through the trees. The jungle was still and quiet, but my heart was still pounding in my chest, a reminder of what had just happened. The spider was gone, but so was my sense of dignity. I had no idea where it had gone, if it had just stayed in the porta potty or somehow vanished in the chaos. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away from that damn thing as possible. I walked back toward the trailhead, still shaken, still hearing my own voice echoing in my head, still feeling the ghost of the spider's legs on my skin. The trail that had seemed so welcoming earlier now felt like a labyrinth. But at least I was out of that porta potty. At least I was alive. By the time I made it back to my car, the sun had risen fully, the bright rays pushing away the last remnants of night. My nerves had settled, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like the spider's eyes were still tracking me. But the day was beautiful, and soon, the forest would be just another place to remember, one with its own set of wild stories to tell. But I was done with porta potties for the day, and maybe forever. It was early fall when I set out on my solo trip to Sleeping Giant Provincial Park in Ontario. The weather was still mild, but you could tell winter wasn't far off. The air had a sharp edge to it, and the wind whispered through the trees like it had something to say, but no one to listen. I wasn't nervous about the hike itself. I'd been out on solo trips before, but the first night, always the first night, had a way of making me uneasy. I'd set up camp just off a trail near the edge of the woods, looking down over a small, sloping hillside that led to a pebble beach along the shore of Lake Superior. The sky was clear as I finished setting up my little two-person tent, but there was a chill in the air that had me pulling on an extra layer. I knew I had to settle in quickly. It'd be dark soon, and I wasn't eager to be out in the woods at night, even though I'd done it before. There's something about the first night of a solo camping trip, something about the unfamiliar sounds of the forest that makes your mind go into overdrive. The forest is always loud. Rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. But when you're alone, those noises have a way of amplifying. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals, maybe a squirrel or raccoon doing its thing. But even so, my nerves were on edge. The campfire had burned down to just a few embers when I crawled into my tent, settling onto my sleeping pad and pulling my sleeping bag tightly around me. I figured I'd fall asleep quick. I was tired from the long day of hiking, but the woods weren't being kind. The wind picked up, and the trees creaked. Something seemed to be making its way through the underbrush, heavier steps, deeper cracks in the twigs. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a deer or something smaller, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closer. The shadows outside my tent moved in strange ways as the wind whipped through the trees. Every so often, a particularly loud rustling would make me tense up, but I still stayed quiet, still. My mind wandered. You know how it is when you're alone at night in the woods. You start thinking of things you wouldn't normally. I wasn't normally one to be scared of things like serial killers in the woods, but tonight, every little sound made my heart race. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that most of these fears were just a product of my imagination. Yet the thoughts kept creeping in. What if someone had been watching me since I set up camp? What if a group of people had decided to follow me out here, just waiting for the right moment? A branch snapped. I froze. I told myself it was just a bear or a deer, maybe even a raccoon, something small. But the sound was louder than that, heavier. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my chest tightening. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers trembling just slightly. The sounds outside my tent grew louder, closer now. A grunt, something soft and deep, then more twigs snapping. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was moving closer, and it wasn't subtle about it. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn the flashlight on, to unzip the door and see what was out there. But then, what if it was something dangerous? What if it was someone, a person, creeping around my tent, watching me? What if it was someone worse? The footsteps stopped. Then came a loud crash. Something big had fallen. I scrambled to unzip the door, holding my breath. My body screamed for me to stay still, to be quiet, to not make a sound. But I didn't want to just sit here, terrified, wondering. I had to know what it was. Slowly, with my heart hammering in my chest, I turned on the flashlight and pulled open the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the slope in front of me. I could see the jagged rocks where the trail dropped off, but the flashlight bounced off the dark shadows, showing nothing. The wind howled around me, and I felt a sudden chill. Then I saw it. A huge shape, its legs sprawled awkwardly as it lay tangled in the rocks at the base of the slope. The animal's head was turned away from me, but its body was enormous. Its thick coat of fur was matted with dirt and leaves. It was an elk. A woodland elk, though, not a familiar sight to most people around here. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I couldn't help but laugh at myself, though it was a nervous kind of laugh. The adrenaline was still running through me, but I couldn't help but feel ridiculous. The elk, groaning slightly, struggled to get up, its hooves slipping as it tried to climb back up the slope. I watched for a moment as it shifted its weight, trying to get its footing on the rocks. Its movements were slow, clumsy, like it had been startled by something, or maybe it was just caught off guard by the terrain. I stayed perfectly still, not wanting to get too close to it. As it finally found its balance and started moving away, it snorted and disappeared into the forest, the sound of its retreating footsteps growing fainter with each passing second. It took me a moment to realize that I was still gripping the flashlight, my fingers numb from holding it so tightly. I closed the door of my tent and sank back down onto my sleeping pad, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease, though my pulse was still quick. I thought I might be able to get some sleep now, but the sound of the wind, the night creatures, and my own racing thoughts kept me wide awake. I never did get much sleep that night. I was 14 the first time I came across something I wish I hadn't. The woods near our home in the small town of Hartsville were my escape. Most kids my age were stuck in the town's dull routine, but for me, the forest was where I went to feel free. I didn't need a map, a compass, or anyone to tell me where I was going. I had walked these trails so many times I could navigate them with my eyes closed. It was always quiet out there, the kind of quiet that felt alive with the sound of trees whispering in the wind and birds calling in the distance. One afternoon, I felt an itch to go further than usual. My parents never really knew how far I wandered. They didn't worry much about me when I was home, so I just left without telling them. I had the whole day, and I knew the trail by heart. The plan was simple: head out to the old logging roads, maybe go a couple of miles farther than usual, and then turn back before dusk. The air was still warm but not too hot. As I started down a familiar path that I often took on those days I needed to clear my head. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for a dirt bike, and I had to be careful of the loose rocks and hidden roots that threatened to trip me up. It was mostly uphill as I made my way through the dense trees, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're walking in a different world. The smell of pine was thick, but the deeper I went, the more the scent of decay started to hang in the air, faint at first but getting stronger the farther I went. At first, I thought it was just a dead animal somewhere nearby, but the stench quickly overpowered the fresh scent of the trees. Something wasn't right. I paused, looking around, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. It was heavy, thick, and sickening. I wrinkled my nose and kept walking, hoping the smell would go away, but it didn't. It got worse. It started to feel like it was following me. I reached a rocky outcrop about 2 miles into the trail. The trees were more sparse here, and the land sloped down sharply into a steep cliff. Below, the ground was littered with rocks and trees that had fallen long ago. I looked down, and at first, I thought it was just a pile of sticks. Then I saw the blood. There, at the bottom of the cliff, was the biggest pile of deer carcasses I had ever seen. At least 20, maybe more. They were piled up in a mess of twisted limbs and decapitated heads, some of them still fresh with the color of recent death, others half-rotted and crawling with flies. It was so bad I almost gagged right there. I had been hunting with my dad before, but I'd never seen anything like this. Some of the bodies were fawns, barely out of their spots, their heads missing, their bodies mutilated. I couldn't tell if it was all one big pile of murder or if different hunters had been dumping their kills here over time. The smell was unbearable now, thick and sour, a mix of decay and something worse. I tried to cover my nose with my sleeve, but it didn't help much. I could feel the bile rise in the back of my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There were some bodies that had been picked clean, their bones exposed, and others were so fresh that their eyes still looked open, staring blankly into the sky. It was surreal, like some twisted, macabre graveyard, the kind of thing you only read about in stories or hear in whispers. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart hammering in my chest. The longer I stared, the more the weight of what I was seeing sank in. I had no idea who would do something like this or why, but I knew it was wrong. I had seen enough, but as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint hum in the distance, the unmistakable sound of engines, a low rumble getting closer. At first, I thought it was just a car on a nearby road, but then it dawned on me that there was no road nearby. I quickly ducked behind the nearest tree, pressing myself flat against the ground, hoping whoever was coming wouldn't see me. My breathing felt too loud, too fast, but I forced myself to stay still. Through the gaps in the trees, I saw them. A pair of four-wheelers, kicking up dirt and gravel as they tore down the old logging road, their engines loud and crude. They were wearing camo, blending into the landscape like they belonged out there. I could feel my heart in my throat as they slowed down, coming to a stop near the pile of carcasses. I barely dared to breathe as one of the men hopped off his bike, dragging a fresh deer carcass behind him. The man tossed it onto the pile, his face hidden under a baseball cap. His companion did the same, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at the pile of bodies. I could feel the weight of their presence, like they were part of the forest, part of the death that had been left behind. They smoked cigarettes and talked, but I couldn't make out their words. The smell was so bad now that I thought I might pass out. I had no idea how long I had been there, crouched behind that tree, praying they wouldn't look in my direction. Time seemed to stretch, dragging on forever. I wanted to move, to get out of there, but I couldn't risk it. I didn't even want to make a sound. They stayed there for what felt like forever, talking, laughing, and tossing more carcasses onto the pile. It was like they didn't even care about what they had done. Like this was just some routine, a normal part of their lives. Eventually, they mounted their four-wheelers again, revved the engines, and took off, leaving the pile behind like a scar on the landscape. The silence after they left felt even more oppressive, like the woods were holding its breath. I waited, watching the trail they had come from, just in case they came back. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. It wasn't until I felt the last of the tension leave my body that I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't take the trail back the way I had come. I wasn't sure what they were doing out there, and I didn't want to be caught anywhere near it. I ran through the woods, my thoughts racing. The image of the deer pile burned into my mind. I knew I had to tell someone, but I didn't know who would believe me. When I got home, I went straight to my parents. I tried to explain, but they didn't take me seriously. They didn't know about the place I had wandered to, and they didn't care to listen. I was punished, grounded for weeks, but I didn't care. I had seen something that would stay with me forever. The only person I could talk to was Mr. Thompson, our neighbor. He was big into hunting, and I knew he'd take it seriously. When I told him, he grew pale. I remember the look on his face, like he knew exactly what it meant. He promised he'd talk to the game warden. He kept his word. The next day, they investigated the site. They found the pile of bodies, but they couldn't find the poachers. No one ever did. Mr. Thompson seemed shaken by it all, but he insisted it wasn't him. I believed him. He wasn't the kind of man who would do something like that. But who were those guys? Why hadn't anyone seen them before? I'll never forget that feeling of unease when I realized that even in a small town like ours, there were people who could hide in plain sight. People who did terrible things and got away with it. I never went back to those woods. No matter how much I wanted to get away, to forget, something about that place stuck with me. It wasn't just the bodies. It wasn't just the poachers. It was the fact that I had been so close to something dark, something I didn't fully understand. And maybe that's what scared me the most. The idea that some things are never meant to be discovered. It was a warm evening in mid-August when my dad and I arrived at our campsite near Lake Ewing. The area was remote, nestled deep within the quiet, towering pines of the Cascades. My dad had been planning this trip for months, and we were both looking forward to spending a few days away from the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives. It had been a particularly hectic year, and we both needed a break. We'd packed light, just the basics. A tent, sleeping bags, a small camp stove, and plenty of food and water. The lake was the centerpiece of the campground, its calm waters reflecting the deep blue sky above. On one side, the forest stretched endlessly, the trees dense and ancient. We'd been here before, but it had been several years. Dad had always spoken about a trail that led along the lake's edge and further into the forest. A trail that supposedly led to a hidden waterfall. We had always wanted to explore it, but somehow we never got around to it. That day, though, we were determined. The idea of seeing the waterfall, tucked away somewhere in the woods, excited both of us. So, after we set up camp and ate a quick meal, we grabbed our packs and decided to go for a hike just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was warm but crisp, and there was a slight breeze rustling through the leaves. We followed the trail that wound along the edge of the lake, the water glistening like glass under the fading sunlight. The trail was well-worn, clearly used by other hikers, but it was quiet, far quieter than any popular hiking trail. Felt like we were the only ones there. As we walked, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore was almost hypnotic, and the only other noises were the calls of distant birds and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The trees grew thicker as we ventured further into the forest, their massive trunks towering above us, blocking much of the remaining daylight. The smell of pine and earth was rich in the air, and the sense of isolation was complete. Around the halfway point, we reached a clearing. It wasn't large, just a small pocket of space in the forest, surrounded by trees on all sides. My dad turned to me and said he needed to take a leak, so I turned to face the opposite side of the clearing. We didn't speak much. It was one of those quiet, comfortable moments you have with someone you've known your whole life. It was then that I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, something that might have been the wind or an animal in the underbrush. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "I'm over here." I froze. It wasn't my dad. I turned around quickly, but there he was, standing a few feet away, clearly not the source of the voice. I wasn't sure what to think. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was the voice of a child. I felt a strange chill in my spine. I turned back to look around the clearing, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the dense forest and the soft evening light fading around us. "Dad, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said, sounding puzzled. "I thought it was you." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It came from over there." I pointed to the edge of the clearing, but the trees were empty. For a few seconds, we just stood there, unsure of what to do. The silence felt heavy, pressing in on us. The voice didn't sound malicious, just lost. It sounded like a child, but it didn't make sense. Who would be out here, and how could they have gotten so close without us hearing them? We spent the next half hour combing the area. We called out, hoping to hear some response, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the air heavy, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the lake. We looked around every corner of the clearing, and then ventured a little further into the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing. Just the empty, untouched forest. Eventually, we gave up, both of us uneasy but not wanting to admit it. We agreed to turn back and make our way back to camp. The light was fading fast, and the thought of walking through the forest in the dark didn't appeal to either of us. We didn't speak much as we started back along the trail, our footsteps quiet on the forest floor. But then it started. At first, it was barely perceptible. A snap of a twig here, a rustle of leaves there. We both stopped, looking around, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no animals. Could have been the wind, I told myself. But then it happened again, louder this time. Something following us, just behind the tree line, staying just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my dad, who was looking just as uneasy as I felt. He had stopped walking and was scanning the woods around us, his eyes darting from tree to tree. We stood there, listening. The sounds were faint but unmistakable. The soft crunch of twigs underfoot, the rustling of bushes. Whatever it was following us, staying just far enough away to remain out of sight. "Dad," I began, my voice tight, but he raised a hand to silence me. "I know," he muttered, his voice low. We started walking again, this time picking up the pace. The sounds of something following us didn't stop. It was like we were being stalked. I felt a growing unease in my chest, a sense that whatever was out there was deliberate in its pursuit. The crunching of the forest floor seemed to echo in the quiet, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but trees, still and darkening in the shadows. It wasn't long before we reached the edge of the lake. The moon had risen, casting a pale light across the water, and we could see our campsite in the distance, just beyond the trees. The sounds of something following us had stopped, but the feeling that we were being watched didn't. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing. We reached the campsite and my dad quickly started a fire. I helped gather some wood, trying to push the feeling of unease from my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that something or someone had been watching us. That night, the sounds of the forest felt different. The usual noises, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind were absent. Instead, the night felt too quiet. The fire crackled in the silence, and every now and then, I thought I heard something in the woods, just beyond the light of the fire. But when I looked, there was nothing there. We didn't speak much as we sat around the fire. We didn't need to. Both of us knew what had happened, what we had heard, what we had felt. Neither of us brought up the voice we had heard in the clearing, but we both knew it had been real. And neither of us felt like discussing the strange sounds that had followed us back to camp. The next morning, we packed up quickly, not saying much. The air felt heavy with the weight of our thoughts. We didn't speak of what happened, but we both knew we wouldn't be coming back to that place. We drove home in silence. The forest and the lake were behind us, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow that hadn't quite let go. And as we left the Cascades behind, I couldn't help but wonder, what had really been following us that night? I've always liked being alone in the woods. I don't mean a walk around the block or some well-lit trail behind a schoolyard. I mean deep woods, where the trees lean in close and it gets so quiet you can hear your own breath bounce off the bark. The kind of place that still feels like it did 100 years ago. I guess that's why I started hiking the way I do. I live in a small town in southern Pennsylvania. I won't name it, but if you've ever driven through this part of the state, you know the kind of place I'm talking about. The edges of the town kind of bleed into the woods. One minute you're in someone's backyard, the next you're standing in a clearing with nothing but squirrels and dead leaves for company. A lot of the people who live here don't go far into the woods. They hunt a little, maybe go mushroom picking in the fall. But I go further than that. It started as a habit to clear my head after long shifts at the warehouse, but eventually it turned into something more. Over the years, I started heading out later and later, until sometimes I'd hike through the night. I liked the quiet. There's something about walking under the stars, with nothing but a headlamp and a thermos of coffee, that made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. Sometimes, I stayed out long enough to see the sunrise breaking through the trees, that golden hour where everything is quiet and the birds are just waking up. That was the best part. Anyway, this one night happened in mid-October of 2019. I remember that clearly because the leaves were at their peak color. The air was cold, maybe in the low 40s, and you could see your breath when you stopped moving. I had planned to do an overnight hike through a section of woods that sits about 6 miles south of town, past the old quarry. It's not a trail you'll find on a map. It's something I pieced together over years of wandering. I left my apartment around 10 p.m., packed light. Thermos, flashlight, knife, lighter, trail bars, and a small tarp in case it rained. I parked just off a maintenance road that runs behind an abandoned gas station, cut through a drainage ditch, and entered the woods near the base of an old pine ridge. Everything was normal for the first few hours. The forest was quiet. I followed a familiar path that ran parallel to a dry creek bed. Every so often, I'd hear a fox bark in the distance or the crack of a branch far off. Nothing unusual. I took my time, stopped to sit once or twice, sipped coffee and watched the stars. The moon was nearly full that night, so I didn't even use my headlamp unless I needed to see the ground up close. The silver light made everything feel calm. But around 2:30 a.m., something changed. I had just come over a small rise and entered a low, wooded valley. It's a part of the forest I don't visit often because the undergrowth there gets thick, and it's easy to lose your sense of direction. But I wanted something different that night, something quiet and off the usual path. I remember noticing how still everything felt. No wind, no rustling, no distant animal sounds, just dead silence. And then I smelled smoke. Not the kind from a forest fire. This was more like someone burning paper or plastic. Sharp and sour, like the tail end of a campfire that never should have been started. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled like something that had been burning for a while. I slowed down, turned off my headlamp, and crouched low. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out there. No campsites, no cabins, no hunting blinds. Just woods. I figured maybe some kids had come out to party or light fireworks. It wouldn't be the first time. So I kept going, but slower, watching the trees and the darkness between them. After about 10 minutes, I saw a faint orange glow through the trees. At first, I thought it might have been someone with a lantern or flashlight, but as I got closer, I realized it was a fire, a small one low to the ground. I didn't hear voices, didn't hear footsteps or laughter, just that smell and the crackle of fire. Then I stepped through a cluster of brush and stopped dead. Right in front of me, maybe 50 feet ahead, was what looked like a small shanty town. I didn't have a better word for it then, and I still don't. Maybe 8 or 10 little structures, cobbled together out of scrap wood, plastic tarps, bed sheets, and metal siding. They were all low to the ground, some barely tall enough to sit in, let alone stand. A few had tarps draped over sticks. One had what looked like a car door leaned up as a wall. It looked like someone had built a village out of trash. Right here, in the middle of nowhere, there were old shopping carts filled with clothes, a broken bike missing both wheels, a pile of rusted canned food near a torn plastic cooler. And in the center of it all, there was a fire pit. Not a proper one either, just the hollowed-out shell of a car tire, blackened from use, and in it, a smoldering fire still burning low. The whole thing was dead silent. I stood there for a long minute, not sure if I should keep going or turn around. My first thought was that maybe it was a homeless encampment. I'd heard rumors about that before. People living off-grid deep in the woods, avoiding attention. But if this was one of those camps, why was no one here? The fire was still burning, and from the look of the camp, it had been used recently. There were personal things lying around, blankets, old shoes, cans of food with spoons still in them. A cheap transistor radio sat on top of an upside-down crate. One of the shanties had a string of beads hanging from the entrance. Another had a small teddy bear propped up against the wall, its fur matted and gray with age. I took a step forward, then another. My boots barely made a sound on the leaf-covered ground. I moved slowly, careful not to trip on anything. The smoke from the fire was thin now, curling into the sky. There was a broken folding chair near the fire pit, half collapsed. I looked down and saw footprints in the dirt, dozens of them, some overlapping. All bare from what I could tell, some small, others larger. I kept expecting someone to step out from one of the shacks, maybe to yell at me or ask who I was, but nothing happened. I walked around the camp in a slow circle, eyes scanning everything. There were no names, no signs, no obvious organization, just junk and silence. One of the structures had a makeshift shelf nailed into the side of a tree, holding a few empty pill bottles and a paperback book with the cover torn off. That's when I noticed something that really bothered me. There were no animals, no squirrels, no birds, not even bugs. Not a single sound besides the pop of the fire and my own footsteps. And the deeper I moved into the little camp, the more it felt like I was standing in a place that had been left in a hurry. A pile of socks lay near one hovel, still damp from what might have been a recent wash. A pot of rice, burnt and crusted to the bottom, sat near the fire. Someone had been cooking. Recently. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. But I know the feeling I had in my stomach. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I had stumbled onto something that had been meant to stay hidden. Something private. It didn't feel right to be standing in the middle of that silence, looking at the leftovers of a dozen lives that had just vanished. Eventually, I turned around and left. I didn't run, but I walked fast. My ears were tuned to every sound, though there still weren't any. The deeper I got into the trees, the more the forest felt normal again. I heard an owl, then a rustle, then the distant bark of a coyote. And finally, when I stopped and turned back, the smell of smoke was gone. I hiked straight back to my car, didn't stop, didn't take breaks. I was sweating under my coat, even though the air was freezing. My legs ached. By the time I got back to the lot, the sky was just starting to turn light over the treetops. I sat in my car for a long time before I started it. Just sat there with the doors locked, hands on the wheel. I kept thinking about that fire. It shouldn't have still been burning if no one was around. Someone had tended it. Someone had left it alive. I never saw anyone. Not that night, not since. I've gone back during the day once or twice, but I never found the camp again. I know I went the same way, followed the same trail, but the valley felt different. Like something had been cleared out or moved. Or maybe I just couldn't find it because it wasn't meant to be found again. That's what haunts me the most. Not what I saw, but what I didn't. Whatever was going on out there, it had been real. There was no doubt about that. The structures were solid. The fire was hot. The clothes, the tools, the scraps, they were all real. But the people were gone. Every trace of them. I still hike, still go out late sometimes. But I don't go to that part of the woods anymore. I don't try to find the camp. I don't talk about it much either. Most folks wouldn't believe me. They'd say I imagined it or misremembered. But I didn't. There's something about seeing a place where people clearly lived, where they cooked and slept and built little lives out of nothing, and then finding it completely silent, that sticks with you. I keep wondering what could have made them leave like that. No footprints leading away, no trail of trash, no signs of a struggle. Just a quiet fire burning in the dark, waiting for someone who never came back. And me, standing there alone, watching the smoke rise into the night. I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. Not every day, but enough to leave a pit in my stomach when I see pine trees packed tightly on either side of an empty dirt road. Enough to keep me awake some nights when my mind decides to wander. It's not the slashed tires themselves. It's not even the fact that someone did it. It's the knowing. The knowing that whoever it was had been there, close enough to see us, maybe even close enough to touch us, without us ever seeing or hearing a damn thing. This was in the summer of 2018. I was 26 then, still young enough to be reckless, old enough to think I was being careful. Me and a group of friends, 8 of us in total, decided to get out of the city for the weekend. We were living in Grand Junction, Colorado at the time, and we all had jobs we hated, lives that felt a little too stale. So we planned a long weekend trip to clear our heads. We weren't hardcore backpackers or anything. This wasn't that type of group. We liked camping, but more the car camping type, haul in a cooler, pitch some tents not far from the cars, sit around the fire and drink a bit too much. We picked a spot out near the Rio Blanco area, southwest of Meeker. It was BLM land, public access, and I'd been there once or twice before with my girlfriend and another couple. It's real remote out there, and I mean it in the truest sense. You take a Forest Service road that branches off from County Road 5. Then you're driving gravel and dirt for over an hour. We clocked it on the way out, an hour and 27 minutes from the last paved intersection to where we finally camped. And not once the entire way in did we pass another vehicle. No cars, no people, nothing. Just pine and spruce trees swallowing both sides of the road and the occasional open clearing that gave way to low ridgelines and dry creeks. There were 3 cars between us. An older white Suburban that belonged to my friend Paul, my black Tacoma, and Ashley's Subaru Outback. I rode with my girlfriend Sarah in the Tacoma. We led the way since I'd been out there before. Everyone else followed. The further we got from the highway, the quieter it got. No planes overhead, no distant engines, just tires crunching gravel and the occasional squirrel darting across the road. We passed a few primitive camp spots, flat pull-offs with old rock fire rings, but I wanted to get us further out past where I'd been before. Eventually, we found it. It was just a wide bend in the road where the trees opened up on the left side. There was a slight slope into a clearing with a flat grassy area and some low boulders scattered about. The forest pressed in on the other three sides like a horseshoe, but we could still see the road from the clearing. A fire ring was already there, stones stacked in a neat circle with some half-burned logs still inside. You could tell someone had camped here before, but not recently. No trash, no footprints, just quiet. We parked the cars about 30 yards from where we set up camp, tucked off into the trees to leave more room for tents and the fire. That's important. The cars were visible, but not close. Close enough that we could see the top of them if we looked through the trees, but not close enough to hear much from that direction, especially if we were talking or if the wind picked up. We got camp set up like we always did. Everyone knew their roles. Tents first, firewood next, then dinner. The sun was already starting to drop when we got everything settled. It was late June, and the days stretched out golden and warm. The air was crisp, smelled like pine sap and sun-warmed dirt. It was one of those places that felt so far from the real world that you almost forget it exists. There was no cell signal, not even a flicker, just wilderness and each other. We grilled hot dogs over the fire, passed around beers and seltzers, laughed too loud. There was music playing from someone's Bluetooth speaker, but only for a while. We shut it off when it started getting dark. We didn't want to draw animals, and honestly, the silence out there was part of the draw. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped fast. The shadows got long, and the trees turned from green to black. We finished dinner just as twilight was fading, cleaned up everything. We were meticulous about that. Packed all the food into bear-proof bins, tied up the trash, made sure there weren't any scraps or greasy pans lying around. A couple of us carried the food bins over to one of the cars since we didn't want them near the tents. That's when we noticed the tires. Started with Paul. He was the first to say something. I remember the way he stopped mid-step, looked down, and then just stood there, not moving. I thought maybe he'd stepped on something or spotted a snake. But then he crouched, put his hand on the tire, and ran his fingers along the sidewall. I walked over. I thought it might have been a flat from the drive-in. That happens. Sharp rocks, old tires, heat, pressure. But then I saw it. There was a clean slit in the sidewall just above the rim, about 3 inches long. Not jagged, not torn. Clean, straight slice. Too clean for a rock or stick. It looked like it had been made with a blade. I got a bad feeling in my chest. That low, sinking pressure, like when you've forgotten something important or realize you've made a mistake but don't yet know how bad it is. Then someone else shouted. Another tire. Same side of the car. Then the third vehicle. Same thing. Passenger side front tire. All 3 cars. 3 identical slashes in the exact same spot. There was no noise. No sounds of movement. Nothing had alerted us. And remember, we were way out there. Forest Service Road. No other people, no sign of another soul for hours. If someone had driven in, we would have seen headlights bouncing through the trees. We would have heard an engine, gravel crunching under tires. But there'd been nothing. At first, a couple of people thought it was a prank, that one of the guys was screwing around. But it didn't take long for that theory to fall apart. The 3 guys, me, Paul, and another friend, Jason, had been together almost the entire time leading up to it. Between cooking, hauling gear, and gathering wood, we hadn't split off. Plus, these were my best friends. I trusted them completely, and this wasn't a joke. Not this deep in the wilderness. Not with slashed tires. We stood there in the dimming light, staring at those clean cuts in the rubber. No one spoke for a while. Not really. It was like we were waiting for something. Some realization or explanation to come in and tell us it was fine, that it was just coincidence or a weird animal thing. But that never came. The deeper the silence got, the more the unease turned to fear. We all got spooked fast. Not just nervous, genuinely panicked. That kind of tight-chested, heart-hammering fear that feels like it doesn't come from your brain but from something deeper. A gut feeling, primal instinct. Someone had been there. While we cooked, while we laughed and drank and thought we were safe. Someone had crept close enough to our cars to slash each front tire and slip back into the trees without us hearing a thing. The firelight flickered behind us, casting shadows across the trunks. I remember looking into those woods, seeing nothing but black between the trees, and wondering how many eyes were looking back at me. We didn't have time to wait and find out. Paul had a gun. He always brought it on camping trips, and he pulled it from his tent without hesitation. While the rest of us scrambled to get the spares on, he stood guard, watching the tree lean, listening. His face was pale. We all were. None of us wanted to sleep there anymore, not even for another hour. The idea of climbing into a tent after that, zipping yourself into a nylon cocoon, blind and vulnerable, while some unknown person was out there in the dark, it was unbearable. We moved fast, not even talking much. Just headlamps and cold sweat and hands working on lug nuts. I had a 4-way tire iron in the back of my truck and used it to help the others. The thing about donuts, those little spare tires, they're not meant for long drives or rough roads. But it was all we had. And by the time the last car was ready, the night was fully settled. Black sky, stars bright like pinholes. No moon yet, just us, the fire dying behind us, and miles of dirt road between us and pavement. We didn't even pack everything, just the essentials. Some tents were left, some chairs, a couple of bags. We didn't care. We had to get out. Paul drove in front, Sarah and I followed, and Jason brought up the rear. The 3 cars crawled over the road, slow and shaky on those spares. Every bump felt like it might blow a tire. We kept the windows down, ears open, eyes scanning. The woods on either side pressed close, tighter than before. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every branch crack made us flinch. When we finally hit the highway, none of us spoke. We didn't cheer, didn't laugh, didn't even breathe easy. We drove until we had cell service, then pulled into a gas station and called the cops and the local ranger station. Gave them the exact road, the coordinates, everything. They said they'd send someone out to check, but there wasn't much they could do. The cop was calm but firm. Said it was good we were packing, that people go missing out there sometimes, and to be careful. That stuck with me. I didn't go back. Not to that spot. Not even to that region. I still camp, but never without signal, never that deep in the backcountry. The memory of it was the sort of honeymoon most people dream about. Just the 2 of us, alone on an island in the Andaman Sea, Thailand. We were in our early 30s, just starting our life together, fresh off the excitement of our wedding. We'd been dreaming about this trip for months, carefully planning every detail. Our days were filled with sun, crystal clear water, and perfect sunsets. But as the sun began to dip lower on that second day of our honeymoon, things took a strange, unsettling turn. It was supposed to be an easy hike through the jungle. I had read that there were marked trails to a viewpoint, a secluded spot with panoramic views of the ocean. We had been warned by locals to be cautious, but that warning felt more like the usual tourist spiel, the kind you brush off when you're young and eager to explore. Who wouldn't want to see an untouched part of the island? I held my wife's hand, feeling the slight dampness of her skin, probably from the humidity that seemed to settle in the air by mid-afternoon. She was the more cautious of the 2 of us, always checking our map, making sure we stayed on track. But we were doing well, cutting through thick foliage, our feet crunching against the earth as we made our way deeper into the jungle. Birds cawed overhead, and insects hummed persistently around us. At some point, I lost track of time. We had been walking for nearly 2 hours, maybe more. The sounds of the island had shifted. The usual chorus of tropical life was muffled, and a heavy silence hung in the air. I didn't think much of it at first, just the weight of the jungle surrounding us. But then it came, a scream, a shrill, blood-curdling scream, a sound so raw, so full of panic and desperation, it sliced through the air like a knife. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I immediately turned to my wife, her face suddenly pale as she looked at me, both of us frozen for a second. My first thought? Someone had fallen, maybe broken a leg. Someone in pain, lost, alone, needing help. The scream came again, a tortured wail echoing through the trees. There was no question, we had to find them. Stay close, I told my wife, gripping her hand tighter, and we started moving in the direction of the sound. The jungle was dense, the path barely visible in the thick green, and every step seemed to take us further away from the comfort of our cozy cabin by the beach. But we kept going, the urgency of the scream driving us forward. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as we moved deeper into the jungle, shadows lengthening. The air was stifling, but my mind was focused solely on reaching whoever was in distress. The scream had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, but I knew we couldn't be far. Then we saw him. He was standing near a thick tree, barely visible at first. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with panic. His mouth working as though trying to speak, but only managing a strangled sound. I couldn't understand him at first. His words were jumbled, his body shaking, nearly collapsing as he dropped to his knees in front of us. He was obviously disoriented, exhausted, and completely hysterical. We moved closer, my wife instinctively going to his side, trying to get him to calm down. I felt a surge of relief, glad we had found someone who could speak, who was alive. "Can you hear me? Are you all right?" I asked, unsure of what to do. His eyes darted around, frantic, as if he couldn't quite register our presence. He opened his mouth again, his words coming in fits and starts. I've been lost," he gasped, his chest heaving. A full day. Couldn't find. I was so scared. I knelt down beside him, offering him a bottle of water, which he drank greedily. He was shaking, his body too worn down to stand on its own. He looked like he had been through something awful, something far worse than just getting lost. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. He barely registered me, his eyes flitting around as though something invisible was chasing him. But he finally spoke again, his voice weak but clearer now. "A day. I lost the trail. My phone. Dead. I thought I was going to die out here." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. A full day? That's how long he had been out here, lost in this jungle? My heart skipped a beat as I thought of how easily that could have been us. Had we wandered off track just a little farther, without the map, without the sense of direction? It made the tropical beauty of the jungle seem suddenly more menacing. "Where are you from?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going, to keep him grounded, to make sure he stayed conscious. He stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if struggling to connect the dots. "I live just a mile from you, in England. I work with your friend, Luke." His voice trailed off, barely more than a whisper. I froze, my brain scrambling to make sense of what he had just said. My friend Luke? I didn't know anyone out here. How could he know us? We didn't know him. His breathing was ragged, and he seemed to have lost the thread of conversation, fading in and out of awareness. But before I could respond, my wife quickly pulled out her phone. Miraculously, there was a faint signal. She dialed the emergency services, explaining the situation, and within minutes, we had help on the way. As we sat there, waiting for rescue, I couldn't shake the bizarre coincidence. A man lost in the jungle, desperate for help, only to turn out to be someone from back home. Someone connected to my best friend in a place I had never expected to see anyone I knew. My mind raced as I tried to process it. The randomness, the strangeness of it all. We stayed with him until the rescue team arrived. 2 men with machetes cutting through the thick undergrowth, guiding the way. They took the stranger on a stretcher, and we followed them back toward the nearest exit of the jungle. The last remnants of daylight were nearly gone, the sky now bathed in twilight, and the sounds of the jungle had returned to their usual rhythm. By the time we made it back to our cabin, the stranger had calmed, though he was still in a dazed state. It was clear that this had been an ordeal, one he would remember for a long time. As the rescue team left, they made sure he was okay, and we were left standing outside our cabin, staring at the night sky. I turned to my wife, still processing everything that had just happened. "Can you believe it?" I asked her quietly, half to myself. "The guy works with Luke. How did he end up here?" She shook her head, too tired to respond, but I knew she was just as rattled as I was. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of the whole thing, but the answer never came. The man who had been lost was never able to give us much more information, and after a few days of recovery, he was flown back home. But there was something about that experience, something about the strangeness of it all that stuck with me. Maybe it was the coincidence, the sheer randomness of encountering someone from our home country in the middle of the jungle. Maybe it was the overwhelming feeling of how fragile life could be, how easily things could go wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't shake it. I was glad we were able to help him, but I also felt an eerie sense of unease that lingered long after we left Thailand, long after the honeymoon was over. Somehow, it felt like we'd barely escaped the jungle ourselves. I just graduated from college, fresh out of a place where I had few connections, no friends, and no real direction. The summer of 2013 was an overwhelming transition, and I had no idea what to do with myself. The world felt wide open, but I felt completely lost in it. I'd grown up in the mountains, so the idea of spending time hiking in the wilderness seemed like the only thing that would help clear my head. There was this one area I'd hiked a few times before, a stretch of land that wasn't a designated park or trail, but an old herding path used only by locals and the occasional lost hiker. It was far enough from anything recognizable that it always felt like the edge of the world. On this particular day, in early August, the air was heavy with the warmth of summer, but the breeze carried a dryness that made every step feel more intense. The sunlight blazed through the trees, making the path feel even more remote. I didn't think much of it as I started my hike, figuring it would be a nice break from the uncertainty I was feeling. The trail was difficult to follow. It was marked only by faint tire treads and overgrown grass that barely cleared the path. No signs of life, really, just the quiet of the woods around me. The trail ran along a stream, which I'd always found beautiful but slightly eerie. The water was clear, running fast in places and slow in others. The trees that lined the banks, spruce mostly, provided little shade, but the river's steady gurgling kept me company. As I hiked, I noticed that the trees seemed to grow taller here, their branches stretching wide and thick, almost like they were holding something back. Maybe I was just imagining things. I was wearing my usual hiking gear, boots, a jacket for the bugs, and cargo pants, as I'd heard about ticks and didn't want to take any chances. The heat quickly soaked through my clothes. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, my legs aching with the weight of it all. By the time I reached a nice bend in the river, I was absolutely drenched. The air felt like it was thickening, pressing down on me. The water ahead of me shimmered, inviting, and I could feel a wave of relief wash over me. My throat was dry, and I needed to cool off. I'd read once about how getting into cold water could be good for you, especially after a long, exhausting hike, so I figured I'd take the chance. Besides, no one would be around. There were no other trails, no signs of people. It was just me, the water, and the riverbanks. I stepped into the river cautiously, wading through the shallow part first, my boots squelching with every step. The coolness of the water felt like heaven on my skin, though I quickly realized that it was far deeper than I expected. The water, which had looked inviting from a distance, came up to my chest after only a few steps. I could feel the coolness seep through my clothes, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting it wash over me. I wasn't worried. After all, I was in a place no one else knew about. It was just me and nature. I stripped off my jacket, my pants, and my boots, leaving them on the shore in a pile. My clothes felt like they weighed a ton compared to the lightness of my skin against the water. I stood there in the cool current for a long while, letting the water surround me and clear the heat from my body. It was so peaceful, the only sound being the rush of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. It wasn't until I started feeling better, more relaxed, that I decided to see what was around the bend. The stream curved around the corner, and I wondered if there might be something more interesting further along. The idea of exploring, of wandering deeper into the wild, was too tempting to ignore. I moved slowly, silently, careful not to disturb the water too much. My feet skimmed the riverbed, testing for rocks, while I pushed my way through the water. It was deeper here, the current more powerful, but the river was wide and open enough that I felt a sense of freedom. As I neared the bend, the trees seemed to crowd in a little tighter, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The silence felt comforting, as if the world around me was holding its breath. The first thing I saw as I rounded the bend was the spruces, their thick trunks covered in a green moss that made the whole area seem darker, more enclosed. The sight of a large rock just ahead made me stop, and for a moment, I was drawn to it, as if something was subtly telling me to look closer. Then, through the branches, I saw something move, a shadow that was too big, too slow to be a deer. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not daring to move. I didn't want to make a sound, but my mind was racing. I leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. It wasn't until I looked a little closer that I realized what I was seeing. A massive bull moose, its antlers wide and imposing, standing in the water, its head lowered to drink from the river. It was beautiful, majestic even, but it was also terrifying. The bull moose was no more than 50 feet from me. It was completely unaware of my presence, its large, dark eyes fixed on the water. The only sound was the gentle splash of its hooves against the rocks as it drank. I wanted to move, wanted to get away, but I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, anything, but my body refused to listen. I was completely still, hoping that it wouldn't notice me, hoping that it would just finish drinking and walk away. But it didn't. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to hold my breath, trying not to make a sound, but eventually, the panic set in. My legs were trembling, and my heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure the moose could hear it. I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my chest, and that's when the thought hit me. What if it sees me? What if it charges? The water was deep and I was exposed. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Without thinking, I turned around and began to move back toward the shore, my feet slipping on the slick rocks beneath me. I was trying to be as quiet as possible, but the fear was overwhelming. Every step felt like it was echoing through the woods, and I was sure the moose could hear me, could sense that something wasn't right. I don't remember exactly what happened next. It's all a blur of frantic movement, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and my mind chanting over and over, "I don't want to die," like some kind of mantra. I don't even know why I was saying it. Maybe I thought it would keep me safe, or maybe it was just the panic talking. I reached the shore and scrambled to gather my clothes. I didn't care how exposed I was or how ridiculous it was to be standing naked in the woods. I just wanted to get away. I didn't look back at the moose, but I could feel its presence behind me, like it was watching, waiting. I ran. I didn't care if the woods were dense or if the branches scratched at my skin. I just ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath ragged and uneven. I was fully aware that I was running naked through the forest, but I didn't care. I finally stopped when I reached a small clearing and hurriedly put on my underwear and shoes. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several attempts to get my pants back on. I didn't stop moving. I didn't care about anything but getting out of there. I ran until I reached the trailhead, my heart still racing, and every part of me screamed to keep going until I was safely back at my car. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door behind me and just sat there for a while. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my mind still spinning. The whole experience felt surreal, like I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. I kept telling myself I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just come too close to something I couldn't fully understand. Eventually, I calmed down enough to drive home, but even then, I couldn't stop thinking about the moose. The size of it, the way it stood there, unaware of my presence. I still don't know how I didn't make a sound when I saw it. I don't know how I got away without it charging me, but I do know that I'll never forget that moment, that fear, and the way the woods suddenly felt so much more dangerous than they ever had before. and I never hiked that trail again. Not once. I spent a good part of my early 20s getting into bouldering and outdoor climbing. It started as something casual, a weekend hobby with a few buddies from university. I was 24 at the time, living in a cramped apartment in Des Moines, Iowa, and itching to get away from the concrete for stretches at a time. About 2 hours southeast of the city, just past Ottumwa, there's a stretch of thick, mostly unmanaged forest that we used to frequent. It wasn't a national park or anything official, just miles of untamed woodland that ran along the Des Moines River, broken up by cliffs, huge rocks, and boulders the size of pickup trucks. The kind of place where no cell signal ever reached and you'd be hard-pressed to see another soul unless they knew it existed. We called it the Hollow. No real reason, it just sounded cool at the time. There were 4 of us who'd go there regularly: me, Jared, Nolan, and Kaylee. We'd load our cars with gear on Friday afternoons and drive out. We'd hike in a few miles from a makeshift parking area off a gravel road, pitch our tents, and spend the weekend climbing, drinking warm beer, and falling asleep under stars so bright they looked fake. That summer was our 3rd year doing this. By then, we all knew the area like the backs of our hands. We had a routine. Same site every time, a relatively flat clearing tucked back in the trees, shielded by a massive boulder we called the Whale because of its rounded back. Fire pit in the center, tents set up in a semicircle, food tied up in bags and hoisted into the trees to keep raccoons away. Felt safe, comfortable, even like we'd carved out our own secret spot in the middle of nowhere. It was in late July that something happened that changed everything. That weekend started like any other. We got there Friday evening, set up camp, made some fire, cooked sausages and beans on a little portable stove, and cracked open a few cans. The night was warm and the bugs were relentless, but nothing unusual. We turned in around midnight. The next morning, Kaylee couldn't find her boots. She swore she'd left them just outside her tent, under the rain fly like always. But when we looked, they were gone. Not just the boots, either. Her chalk bag was missing. So was one of her hoodies, a thin fleece she wore around the campfire. At first, we figured she'd moved them and forgotten. That happened all the time. Someone would leave their gear over by the Whale or down by the stream and panic the next morning thinking it was stolen or lost. We checked the area. Nothing. We spent the morning retracing our steps, thinking maybe she dropped the stuff along the path from the tent to the climbing spot. No luck. Her stuff was just gone. We all tried to laugh it off. Maybe a raccoon or coyote dragged it off. Maybe she packed it weird and it'd show up later. Didn't. And even though none of us said it out loud, I could feel that unease creeping in, a tiny crack forming in the wall of trust we'd built around this place. Kaylee had to borrow gear for the rest of the weekend. We tried to make the best of it. Climbing was good, the weather held, and nothing else strange happened. We drove back Sunday night and didn't talk much on the way home. Nobody wanted to admit it, but the place felt different after that. Just slightly off, like someone had been watching. We skipped going back the next few weekends, which was rare. Everyone had an excuse: work, family, too tired. But eventually, in early August the following year, we decided to go back. Just me, Jared, and Nolan this time. Kaylee had moved to Colorado and wasn't around anymore. I remember how dry it was that summer. The leaves felt like paper underfoot. The usual trickle of water in the streambed by the Whale was down to a muddy puddle. It hadn't rained in weeks. We got there late Friday, pitched our tents, and sat around the fire as usual. Talked about life, laughed about how long it had been since we were last there. No mention of the gear going missing. Felt almost normal again. Later that night, after dinner, I walked off into the trees to take a piss. The fire was still going behind me, flickering through the trunks, casting a soft orange glow on the underbrush. I stepped maybe 40 feet away from the site, enough to be out of sight. I was standing there, just finishing up, when I caught something in the corner of my eye. Movement, but deliberate, controlled. It took a second for my brain to make sense of it. About 30 feet away, lying flat on his stomach behind a patch of ferns, was a person, a man. I could see the outline of his body, shoulders, arms, legs, all wrapped in a ghillie suit, the kind snipers wear to blend in with the forest floor. He was propped up on his elbows, head angled toward our camp. He was watching us. I didn't move, neither did he. For a few seconds, it was like time paused completely. Then his head shifted barely, but enough that I knew he'd seen me. A second later, he pushed himself up, turned, and ran. Not just a lazy jog. He bolted, low to the ground at first, then upright, disappearing through the underbrush so fast he looked like he was part of it. No sound, no stumbling, like he'd done this before. I didn't chase him. Couldn't. My legs felt frozen. I stood there staring at the space where he'd been, the imprint in the ferns slowly rising back up like nothing had happened. When I got back to the fire, I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, heart pounding. Jared asked if I was okay. I nodded, said I was just tired. We turned in maybe 20 minutes later. I barely slept. I told them in the morning, left out some details like how long he'd been there or how close he was. I just said I saw someone in a ghillie suit. Nolan tried to laugh, said it was probably some hunter messing around. Jared didn't say anything. I could tell he was spooked. We packed up and left early. That was the last time we went back. In the months after, I tried looking up news stories from the area. Missing hikers, strange reports, anything. I never found anything concrete. No signs of squatters, no arrests, no hunters fined for illegal camping. It's like the guy was never there. But I've thought about it a lot. The gear that went missing, Kaylee's stuff specifically, boots, clothing, chalk bag, things someone might take if they were planning to blend in or mimic or follow. The idea that someone had been watching us even back then makes my stomach turn. The scariest part, though, is how long he might have been there that night. How many times we'd gone out there and never noticed. How many weekends he might have been lying in the woods, just out of sight, learning our patterns, listening to us talk, watching us sleep. Even now, 10 years later, I don't go into forests the same way. I still hike, still climb, but I keep to well-marked trails. I don't camp in remote areas anymore, and I never, ever turn my back to the trees for too long. Some people think the woods are scary because of bears or getting lost or the dark. But the truth is, the scariest thing out there is always going to be another person. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who knows you're coming long before you get there. We were lucky. I know that now. Nothing happened to us. No one went missing. But that doesn't mean we weren't part of someone else's plan. We were just smart or stupid enough to leave before it got worse. I still dream about the guy sometimes. Not his face because I never saw it, but the shape of him. Lying still in the grass, eyes fixed on us. Like we were just another part of the landscape he'd already mapped out. And that spot, the hollow, I couldn't find it now if I tried. We never marked it. Didn't need to. But I think that's for the best. Some places are better lost. Some places you don't go back to, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path echoed through the early morning air, the cool breeze whipping through the sparse trees that clung to the edges of the Scottish hills. I could feel the weight of my pack on my back, but it wasn't enough to tire me out just yet. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the valley. The landscape in front of me was wild, untamed, and the sense of adventure I felt that morning was unlike any I had experienced before. I wasn't used to hiking alone, but after years of exploring nature with my father, I thought I was prepared. My father, always the spry adventurer, had taken me on countless hikes through the highlands, teaching me how to navigate, how to read the land, how to spot dangers before they became problems. He taught me how to respect nature, to understand its rhythms, and to be aware of its moods. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known at the time, was that the land held memories. Memories that would soon come to the surface and change the way I saw everything. It had been some years since I last hiked with him. My father, now in his 70s, had grown slower, his joints aching with age. Still, he had insisted on coming with me on this trip, claiming that it would be one last big adventure. But when the morning came, something in him seemed off. He was quieter than usual, more distant, and despite my best efforts to shake off the unease that had begun to settle in my chest, I couldn't help but feel like we were heading into something bigger than either of us. The journey had started off simply enough. My father and I had packed our bags the night before, preparing for the trek to the cliffs where, according to him, we would get the most breathtaking view of the highlands. It was a route we had done before, a path that led us through open moors, over rocky streams, and finally up to the high cliffs that overlooked the ocean. It wasn't an easy path, but it was one we both knew well, and the challenge of it had always been part of the fun. But as we climbed higher and higher, something started to change. I could see it in his face, the lines around his eyes deepening as he scanned the landscape, his mouth set in a tight line. He wasn't saying much, and I began to wonder if maybe we should have turned back earlier. We reached the top of the ridge by midday, and that's when it happened. The silence between us grew palpable. I watched as my father stopped walking, his body suddenly rigid, his eyes locked on something in the distance. It was as though the world had frozen in that moment, and I could feel my heart race as I tugged at his sleeve, asking what was wrong. But he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the vast, open space in front of us, his breath shallow. I was too young to understand the weight of that silence, the significance of what had caught his attention. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe he was just tired, maybe he was getting a little lightheaded. But I knew him well enough to see that this was something else. He had gone pale. His usually bright blue eyes darkened with a shadow of fear that I had never seen before. It was the kind of fear that made everything around us seem suddenly unfamiliar, as though the ground we stood on had shifted without warning. Without a word, he scooped me up onto his back in one smooth motion, the same way he had done when I was a little girl and too tired to walk any farther. My legs dangled awkwardly as he began to stride away, his pace quickening with every step. I could hear the crunch of the grass beneath his boots, the sound sharp against the silence. And then, over his shoulder, I saw it, a strange object stuck into the ground. It was large, rectangular, and pale yellow, almost as if it had been abandoned there, forgotten by time. It looked out of place, completely out of place. The highlands were rugged, wild, and untouched, and yet there it was, standing upright like some sort of bizarre monument. At first, I thought it was just an odd rock formation, or maybe some kind of strange structure, but then I saw the handle. It was unmistakable. It was a refrigerator. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't understand why it was there, why it had been left in such a remote location, or why my father looked so unsettled by it. He quickened his pace even more, his face set in a grim line, and I could feel his muscles tense beneath me. I wanted to ask him what it was, what he saw, but I knew better than to speak right then. His silence told me everything I needed to know. We didn't stop until we reached the base of the cliffs, and even then, we didn't talk about it. My father never mentioned the refrigerator again, but I could see it in his eyes, the same look that had been there when he first laid eyes on that strange object, that haunted look that lingered for days afterward. It wasn't until much later, when I was older and had learned more about the world, that I began to understand what had happened that day. As a child, I had never thought to ask about the strange feeling that had settled in my father's gaze. But as I grew older, I realized that there was something he wasn't telling me. One night, when I was in my late teens, I brought it up again. I asked him about the fridge, about why he had reacted the way he did. I expected him to brush it off, to make some joke or explain it away. But instead, he grew quiet. "Amy," he said, his voice low and steady. "When I was a boy, my friends and I found an old fridge in the woods. It was just like the one we saw on that hill. We opened it, and inside was a body, a child's body." I didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I had heard rumors, whispers of things like this happening in the past, but to hear it from my own father, someone I had always admired for his strength and bravery, shook me to my core. The child had been trapped in there, somehow. We never knew how it happened, but it was too late. The body was, well, it was beyond anything we could understand. He paused, and I could see the pain in his eyes. It's something I've never been able to forget, and when I saw that fridge on the cliff, I wasn't just seeing an object. I was seeing the past. I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. I had always seen my father as invincible, as someone who had lived through hardships and come out stronger on the other side. But this was different. This was a wound that had never healed, a scar that had remained hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't until years later, when I returned to the highlands on my own, that I began to truly understand the depth of what had happened that day. I hiked the same path we had taken together, my father's words echoing in my mind. I reached the same ridge, the same spot where we had seen the fridge, and I stopped. The wind howled around me, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I could hear the faint sound of someone calling out, though there was no one in sight. I didn't look for the fridge. I didn't need to. I knew it wouldn't be there anymore. But in my heart, I carried the weight of my father's words. And I understood in that moment that sometimes the things we carry with us are not just memories. They are parts of us, scarred into our souls, never to be forgotten. And so, I left the highlands that day, carrying with me not just the beauty of the land, but the burden of a story that would never truly be finished. It was late July, and we were all 16 years old, looking for something exciting to do on a Saturday night. The idea of hiking up to the top of Old Crow Mountain seemed like the perfect way to spend the evening. The weather was warm, a slight breeze drifting through the trees, and it had been a long week of school and summer boredom. It was almost 9:30 p.m. when we piled into my friend Mark's car, laughing and joking about the upcoming meteor shower. The forecast had predicted the best show in years, so we figured we'd get to the top of the mountain, lay down, and watch the stars rain down on us. None of us had ever hiked at night before, but the idea of being up there, away from everyone, under the blanket of stars, felt like an adventure. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Ben, Mark, and his cousin Clara. Mark and Clara were the cousins, both a little more adventurous than the rest of us. Ben and I usually tagged along for whatever crazy idea they had, which worked out just fine for me, anything to break the monotony of the summer. We drove out to the edge of town, a little past the outskirts, toward the base of the mountain. Old Crow Mountain wasn't exactly a major hiking spot. It was one of those places that only locals knew about, tucked away, just far enough from town to feel like a proper escape, but not so remote that you'd feel truly unsafe. The trailhead was hidden among tall trees, the path barely visible in the dark. We made sure to bring our flashlights, although we mostly relied on the light from our phones. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver glow over the path ahead, but it wasn't enough to fully illuminate the trail. Mark joked about how this would be one of those memories to tell our grandkids. But honestly, I was feeling a little on edge. There's something about hiking at night, even with a group, that makes you aware of how small and fragile you are in the vast wilderness. You don't see the animals around you. You only hear the crunch of leaves and twigs breaking underfoot, the rustling of unseen creatures. About halfway up the mountain, we decided to take a break. We were all sweating from the hike, and Mark pulled out some granola bars and water bottles from his backpack. I glanced around, stretching my legs, trying to take in the view of the town lights far below. The trees around us swayed gently in the wind, but there was something off about the moment. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't until Clara pointed it out that we all started to feel the same unease. There was a man standing off the trail, near a group of large boulders. He was dressed in a dark business suit, which stood out like a sore thumb against the natural backdrop. We were all confused. Who would be out here at night dressed like that in the middle of nowhere? At first, we thought maybe he was just another hiker, but he wasn't moving, just standing there watching us. It was like he was waiting for something. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Do you think he's lost?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head. "I don't know. It's just weird." We tried not to stare too much, but I could feel his eyes on us, even from a distance. Mark seemed the least concerned, as usual, but even he couldn't deny how strange it was. We decided to move on, hoping that the guy would just keep to himself and go the other way. But as we started walking again, we noticed something. The man started walking too, at a distance, but always a little too close for comfort. I picked up the pace, trying to act casual, but every time I glanced back, he was still there, walking steadily, his footsteps matching ours. It was almost as if he was trying to stay in our line of sight, keeping a constant distance. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but the whole situation felt wrong. We took another break about 20 minutes later, hoping the guy had either passed us or gone off in another direction. But when I turned around, I could see him clearly. He was no more than 10 feet behind us, his figure illuminated by the faint light from our flashlights. He hadn't tried to pass or turn off the trail. He just kept following us, never speeding up or slowing down. "That's it," Mark said, his tone suddenly serious. "I'm gonna see if he says anything." We all exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody wanted to confront him, but the tension was unbearable. So Mark called out, "Hey, are you okay? Can we help you with something?" The man didn't respond immediately. He just kept walking, the sound of his shoes crunching against the ground filling the air. Then finally he spoke. "Are you all here for the meteor shower?" His voice was calm, low, but it had a strange edge to it, like he wasn't fully there. We all froze for a moment, exchanging glances. It felt off. There was no reason for a guy in a suit to be asking us about a meteor shower. It was too casual, too detached. He didn't seem like someone who was out for a casual hike. He seemed out of place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Yeah, I answered, trying to sound normal, but my voice cracked a little. "We're just watching the stars." "Are you?" He nodded. "Mind if I join you? It's a long walk by myself." A long walk? In a business suit? I looked at my friends, all of us unsure of what to do. It was weird, and honestly, it made me uncomfortable. But at the same time, we didn't know how to handle it. So we just shrugged and kept walking, trying to make it look like it wasn't bothering us. As we moved up the trail, I noticed that the man was walking a little too close to Clara, like uncomfortably close. I could see him glancing at her every now and then, his eyes lingering a little too long, his face oddly calm. It was as if he was following the scent of her shampoo, stepping just a bit closer every few minutes. Clara didn't say anything, but I could see her stiffen, her body language tense. By the time we reached the summit, the man was right behind us. We all sat down on the rocky outcrop, trying to find a good spot where we could watch the stars. But the man, he sat down almost directly next to Clara, so close that she scooted over without even thinking. But he didn't move. He just sat there, looking up at the sky, his suit almost blending into the shadows. I could see Clara's discomfort. Her hands were clenched into fists, her jaw tight. She tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell she was freaked out. I felt it too, an almost palpable sense of wrongness in the air. I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided we needed to leave, and fast. "We should go," I said abruptly. "The meteor shower is over. Let's head back down." Without waiting for any response, I got up and started walking down the trail, with Ben, Mark, and Clara following closely behind. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man still sitting there, unmoving, staring at the sky. The hike down was faster, almost a run. We were all nervous now, the feeling of being followed pressing in on us. But we kept going, our breaths ragged from the descent. I looked back once more, and that's when I saw him again. The man was following us, moving quickly down the trail, faster than we were. His figure was just a shadow in the dark, but I could see the outline of something in his hand. A large stick. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He was coming after us. We picked up the pace, practically running down the mountain. By the time we reached the car, I was out of breath and my heart was pounding. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. We were all in the car now, and we started driving off, still in a daze from what had just happened. As we pulled away, I looked back through the rearview mirror and saw the man, running full speed down the trail, his silhouette against the dim moonlight. We didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the road and our breathing. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him still chasing us, but he was nowhere in sight. We were all shaken, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As we pulled into the driveway, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara, and it linked to a news article. I clicked on it, my stomach dropping as I read the headline: "Man arrested for double murder on local hiking trail." The article described a man who had strangled his wife, then killed a young woman on the very trail we had just hiked. The photo attached was unmistakable. It was the same man in the suit, the one who had followed us, the one who had sat next to Clara. I felt sick to my stomach. We never went back to Old Crow Mountain. None of us ever spoke about that night again. Not to our parents, not to anyone. It was a secret we kept to ourselves. But every time I think about it, I can still picture that man in the suit, his cold eyes, and the way he followed us. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did, but I'm grateful we did. The night was calm as my wife and I paddled our way to our campsite on the narrow, winding lake. The water was so still that it looked like glass, reflecting the dark silhouettes of the trees that lined the shore. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that only a cool evening in early fall could bring. The days had been warm, but now the temperature was dropping fast, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a dark shade of purple that slowly deepened into black. We had been planning this canoe camping trip for a while, but with the busy nature of our daily lives, it had been tough to find the time. But here we were, halfway down the lake at a secluded spot, with only the sound of the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves in the trees to keep us company. There was something peaceful about being out there, far from civilization, surrounded only by nature. It was just the two of us and the quiet. After we set up camp, my wife and I spent a few moments by the fire, talking and relaxing. The fire crackled and popped, sending small embers into the cool air. She sat with her back against a tree, her head leaning back in contentment as the warmth from the flames touched her skin. I could see the faint glow of the fire reflecting off her face, her eyes half closed. She looked at peace. But after a while, the need to freshen up caught up with me, and I excused myself to go down to the lake to wash my face. I stood up, stretching out the tightness in my back from sitting too long, and walked the short distance to the water. The lake was only a few steps away from our camp, and the path was clear, but the moment I stepped down to the shore, something in the air changed. It was the stillness, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like everything is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I knelt at the water's edge, cupping my hands to splash the cool lake water on my face. The night was perfectly silent, except for the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. I rubbed my eyes and wiped the cold water away, then lifted my gaze to the opposite shore, the trees and rocks silhouetted in the dim light of the moon. That's when I saw it. Two small points of light flickering across the lake, barely visible at first. They seemed so far away, and yet they were perfectly clear against the dark backdrop of the forest. At first, I thought they might be stars reflecting off the water, but as I stared at them, I realized they were moving. Two headlamps. They bobbed up and down as though the people wearing them were walking along the edge of the lake on the opposite side, though they were too far away for me to make out any details. The flickering of the lights caught my attention, and I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. The lights were far enough that it was odd to see anyone else this far out on the lake. It was rare to encounter other people on this remote stretch of water, especially at night. I continued to watch, my curiosity growing as the lights slowly began to fade. The heads of the figures wearing them must have been moving, and as they walked further, the beams grew dimmer. I watched, transfixed, as the lights disappeared altogether. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural sound, like something large was snorting or breathing heavily, coming from the same direction where the lights had been. It echoed across the lake, carried by the still air. The sound was loud enough that it made my skin prickle. My first thought was that it might be a moose, a large, powerful animal, the kind that wandered these woods, especially around dusk when they were most active. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't quite the snort of a moose. It was deeper, thicker, almost like the sound of something much larger, like a bear or worse, something predatory. My mind raced, and I stood frozen for a moment. There was a certain tension in the air, the kind that makes you feel as if the world is holding its breath. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I listened intently, trying to pick out more details. The noise was coming from the other side of the lake, but it was clear enough that I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for something. I didn't like the feeling that crept up my spine. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like an instinctual sense of danger, that something wasn't quite right. The silence stretched on for a few seconds before the sound came again. A loud, snorting exhale, followed by the shuffling of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart skipped a beat. The noise was so close to the shoreline, it had to be an animal. But there was a cold edge to the sound that made me feel uneasy. In the quiet of the night, my voice sounded louder than I expected when I called out, "Hey, are you all right over there?" My voice was almost swallowed up by the stillness, but I hoped the people on the other side of the lake would hear me. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. Then faintly I heard a voice. It was distant, but it carried across the lake. "Yeah, we're fine, just a little lost." I let out a breath of relief, but the unease lingered. They sounded like they were in distress, but at least they were answering. I called out again, asking if they needed help, but it was clear they were fine. Or at least they said they were. I still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the situation than they were letting on. After a short exchange, they explained that they had made a mistake when they parked. They'd come from the wrong parking lot, which had delayed them by an hour or two. Then, when they finally arrived at the lake, they had taken the wrong trail and ended up on the far side, which was about a mile out of their way. They were a little lost, a little tired, but otherwise okay. Still, with the darkness and the cold setting in, I could tell they were starting to get worried. I had no idea how much further they had to go to reach their campsite, but I knew they had to be frustrated by the delay. I felt a tug of sympathy for them. It wasn't easy being out there in the dark, especially when you weren't sure where you were headed. The light from their headlamps had long since gone out, and without any source of illumination, they'd be wandering blind, vulnerable to anything that might cross their path. I didn't think twice about offering help. It wasn't even a question. I told them to wait, and I quickly grabbed my canoe, pushed it into the water, and began paddling across the lake. The moonlight reflected off the calm surface, and the paddles cut through the water silently, creating small ripples that shimmered in the quiet night. I focused on the soft swish of the paddles, trying not to think about the strange sounds I had heard earlier. As I approached the far side of the lake, I could just make out two figures standing by the shore, their outlines barely visible against the dark trees. I slowed the canoe and called out to them to make sure they knew where I was. They waved, and I paddled closer, finally pulling up to where they stood. One of them, a man, stepped forward. "Thanks," he said, his voice sounding a bit relieved. I could tell they were both exhausted, and the tension that had been in their voices earlier seemed to evaporate. I handed them the flashlight I had brought along, and they gratefully took it, shining it around the area to get a better sense of their surroundings. I offered to take them to their campsite, and they agreed without hesitation. As I paddled them across the lake, the sound of the snorting animal still echoed in the distance. I couldn't help but wonder what it had been. It didn't seem like a bear or a moose, but I didn't want to scare them with that thought, especially now that they were on their way to safety. The water was calm, and the canoe glided smoothly through the stillness, cutting through the night like a knife. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, as though they were watching us from a great distance. We reached the campsite in silence, the only sounds being the soft lapping of water against the shore and the faint rustling of the trees in the night breeze. I helped them unload their gear and set up camp, and they thanked me again, genuinely relieved to be safe. As I paddled back to my own campsite, the weight of the night settled on me. The stillness of the lake, the strange animal sounds, the flickering lights. It was all behind me now, but it felt like something had shifted. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there in the woods was still watching, still lurking just beyond the trees. Back at our camp, my wife was still by the fire, staring into the flames. I sat down beside her and didn't speak for a while. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound in the quiet night. We both sat there, listening to the wind moving through the trees and the occasional ripple of the lake. It was peaceful, but the events of the evening left me with an uneasy feeling. There was something out there in the dark, something I couldn't explain. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of the animal breathing and the flickering lights played over and over in my mind, as though I was still waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The night passed quietly, and when morning came, it brought with it a sense of calm. The sun rose over the lake, casting its golden light across the water. The world felt normal again, as though the darkness of the night had been nothing but a fleeting moment. But I knew, deep down, that the quiet was only a mask for something deeper that lurked in the shadows of the forest. Something that would always be there, waiting. It's not unusual for me to go out for walks late at night. I've always found something peaceful in the stillness, the cool air, and the quiet that blankets the world once the clock strikes past midnight. I live in a small town where not much ever happens, and I guess that's part of the appeal. On those late walks, the streets feel empty, like I've stepped into a world that only exists for me. I can walk without any distractions, think clearly, and let my mind drift into places where the day-to-day noise doesn't intrude. But that night, 2 months ago now, was different. I left my house just past 1:30 a.m. I've done this enough times to know what to expect. The streets were deserted, the lights casting long, lonely shadows on the pavement. There's a certain comfort in that, a reassurance that I'm the only one out there, at least for now. First, everything was normal. I wandered around the familiar streets, my feet clicking against the asphalt, the sound of my breath the only thing I could hear. The occasional car would pass, but it was quiet, almost like the town was holding its breath. The night air had a crispness to it, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around me. My hands were stuffed in my pockets, and I let my thoughts drift. By the time I reached the edge of town, it was about 2 a.m. I'd gone farther than usual, further into the quiet suburbs that stretched out beyond the city center. I hadn't planned on being out this late, but that was always the thing with late-night walks. They were unpredictable. You just kept walking, letting your feet guide you, not really thinking about the time or the destination. It was when I started heading back home that I noticed something strange. A black van had appeared on the street, coming from the opposite direction. I didn't think much of it at first. There were always cars on the road, even this late, but the van seemed out of place. It was an old model, boxy, with faded paint. It didn't stand out much in the dark, but there was something about it that caught my attention. Maybe it was the way it moved, slow and aimless, like it wasn't really going anywhere. It passed by me without slowing down, but something about it made me uneasy. I shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing. Maybe someone was just driving home from work or coming back from somewhere. I continued walking, my eyes on the pavement, trying to push the thought of the van from my mind. But then, as I turned the corner, I saw it again. The same black van coming down the street. It was moving slowly just like before. I glanced at it briefly, trying to make out the details. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there were no license plates. None. It was the first thing that caught my eye. That's when I started feeling the first twinges of real unease. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it could just be a coincidence. Maybe there was another van just like it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But the second time around, something told me I should keep an eye on it. I kept walking, trying to act casual, but my heart started to race. I picked up my pace, moving faster down the street, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then the van turned the corner ahead of me, and then it stopped, right in the middle of the road. It wasn't parked. It just sat there, blocking the street. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stood there, frozen for a moment. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew something wasn't right. My brain went into overdrive trying to process the situation, but it didn't make sense. Why would someone park in the middle of the road at 2:10 in the morning? I couldn't take any chances. I turned around and started walking quickly, almost jogging now, in the opposite direction. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like they were moving too slowly, as though they couldn't carry me fast enough. I knew the van was still there, just up the road, and the thought of being anywhere near it made my stomach twist. As I turned the corner and glanced over my shoulder, I could see the headlights from the van shining in the distance. It was still there. I didn't stop to look again. I didn't even think about it. I just ran, picking up speed, cutting through the streets, making sharp turns to throw off any chance of someone following me. I turned down another road, and the familiar houses started to blur past me. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was losing myself in the dark, like I was in a maze with no way out. The panic was setting in. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere I could hide until whatever was going on passed. I didn't know what it was. Maybe a bad feeling, maybe the simple fact that the van had no plates, but I wasn't taking any risks. I spotted a yard up ahead, the fence low and barely visible in the night. I didn't hesitate. I veered off the sidewalk and sprinted straight into the yard, ducking behind the fence, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I crouched down, trying to steady my breathing, my heart still hammering in my chest. My ears were straining to hear anything that would tell me what was going on. I stayed there for what felt like forever, holding my breath, listening. I could hear the sound of the van's engine in the distance, but it was getting closer. I felt a tight knot of dread twist in my stomach. It was coming. I could hear it moving slowly, deliberately, down the street toward where I was hiding. The van came closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the yard in flashes. I pressed myself into the ground, trying to be as quiet as possible, my body stiff with tension. It felt like everything around me had gone silent. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. And then the van passed by, slowly, too slowly. It crawled past the yard, and for a second, I thought I might be able to breathe again. But my instincts told me not to move. I stayed hidden, watching through the gaps in the fence. The van didn't stop. It just kept going, driving past. My heart was still in my throat, but I didn't dare move yet. I waited and waited. I could hear the van's engine grow quieter as it continued down the street, until finally, there was nothing but silence. The only sound left was the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. I stayed behind the fence for a good 20 minutes, just waiting, watching the road for any sign that the van might come back. My body ached from the cold, and I could feel the tension in my muscles, but I wasn't going to risk moving yet. Not until I was sure. Eventually, the stillness of the night seemed to calm. The van hadn't come back. It hadn't circled the block, hadn't doubled back, and for a moment, I convinced myself that maybe I was just overreacting, that I had made all of this up in my head. But I wasn't about to test my luck. I waited just a little longer before I finally stood up, carefully peering around the corner of the fence to make sure the street was clear. It was empty. No black van in sight.
No headlights.
No engine. I didn't waste any time. I took off running, making sure to stick to side streets and alleys, anything to keep myself out of view. My house was just a few blocks away, and I moved fast, not once looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop running until I was at my front door. I didn't even use the front door. I didn't have time for that. I climbed up the porch steps and, without thinking, threw myself through the bedroom window. I didn't care about the glass or the risk of cutting myself. I just needed to get inside. Once I was in, I locked everything. I pulled the curtains shut, sat on the floor, and tried to calm my racing heart. I didn't know who was in that van or what they were doing, but I had the distinct feeling that I just narrowly avoided something bad. The next day, I didn't leave the house. I spent the entire day indoors, pacing around, trying to shake the feeling of something still lurking out there. It didn't help that the news that night talked about a string of vehicle-related crimes in the area. I didn't know for sure, but it was hard not to think that the van might have been involved. To this day, I still take late-night walks, but I'm more careful now. I always keep my eyes open, never letting my guard down, always listening. And every time I walk by that yard, I remember that night, the van, the fear, the waiting. I never saw that van again, And honestly, I don't want to. I'm just glad I made it out that night. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth when I set out that morning. It was late fall, the sky a cool, grayish blue. I was 28 at the time, just far enough out of my early 20s to be less reckless, but not quite out of the I'm still figuring things out phase. I didn't know exactly why I wanted to go, but something about the stories my friends had told me about this old mansion just outside of town had stuck with me over the years. They told me about it in passing, about the strange layout, the odd architecture, and the eerie feel of the place. I hadn't been able to shake it. Every time I heard another little detail, my curiosity grew. The mansion was tucked away in a thick stretch of woods, a good 20-minute hike off the main road. It wasn't marked on any maps, at least not officially. Most people didn't even know it existed. The town's few old-timers referred to it as the Miller Estate. And when I asked around, people didn't seem to know much. But the ones who did speak of it warned me not to go near it. That only made it more interesting. I had a few blurry pictures in my mind from the stories my friends had shared. They'd explored it a few times, the house being an abandoned relic that no one had cared enough to preserve. The pictures they showed me years ago had been grainy and faded, but it didn't matter. The images were enough. A huge, dark mansion with spiral staircases, narrow hallways, and an unsettling, disorienting design. They spoke about the master bedroom being particularly striking, a strange, isolated space that led to a small study above the main part of the house. After weeks of obsessing, I finally decided to go on my own. I grabbed a bag with some essentials, a flashlight, water, a camera, a notebook, and a small knife in case I needed it, and set out early in the morning. It was an hour of hiking before I reached the outskirts of the mansion's grounds. There was a faint trail at first, barely visible beneath the dry leaves, but it quickly vanished as I ventured deeper into the forest. The sun was struggling to break through the heavy canopy, casting long shadows and illuminating patches of moss on the ground. Every step I took was accompanied by the crunch of dry leaves, and I had to watch my step as the terrain became more uneven. After what felt like longer than it actually was, I came across the first sign of the mansion. The outline of the large, decaying building loomed ahead, just barely visible through the trees. The closer I got, the clearer the structure became, and soon, I was standing on what appeared to be the edge of a long, cracked driveway that led straight up to the front of the house. I stopped for a second to take in the scene. The mansion, though clearly old, had a grandeur about it that hadn't entirely faded with time. The stone exterior, now covered in thick ivy, was still impressive. The windows were dark, almost like the house was watching me. My heart raced as I stood there, considering how far I'd come and how strange it felt to be alone out here. There was something unsettling about the place, something that tugged at the edges of my nerves. I knew that my friends had described it all before, but seeing it in person made everything feel more immediate, more real. This place was ancient, full of forgotten history, and everything about it felt wrong in a way that was hard to pinpoint. I continued down the cracked driveway. My footsteps echoed unnervingly as I moved forward. As I got closer, I could see that the front entrance was wide open, the doors hanging at odd angles, creaking in the light breeze. The mansion beckoned like a forgotten relic. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The interior was a labyrinth. The first thing that struck me was the size. It was enormous, far larger than I had imagined. The hallways stretched out in strange, angled directions, twisting and turning in a way that didn't make sense. Spiral staircases climbed higher and higher to unknown levels. I took a deep breath and proceeded to explore. The dust in the air was thick, coating everything in a layer of grime. The furniture was either covered in old sheets or completely overturned, as though a great struggle had taken place here. It wasn't the kind of disarray you'd expect from teenage vandals. It was more as if the house had been abandoned in the midst of something that had been interrupted. There were broken items scattered around, shards of glass, books torn from shelves, but it didn't feel like a place that had simply been left behind. It felt like a place where something had happened. I ventured deeper, turning down one narrow hallway after another. Each time, I found myself back where I started, standing in the same entryway or facing the same rooms, though they looked different from other angles. I couldn't help but feel like the house itself was playing tricks on me, like I was losing my bearings the deeper I went. I kept expecting to see something, a figure, a movement, just out of the corner of my eye, but I saw nothing. Finally, I made my way to the master bedroom. This was the part my friends had described in vivid detail. A huge space, dominated by a large bed that was still draped in dusty, faded sheets. There were windows overlooking the surrounding forest, though the glass was fogged up and cracked. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the closet doors were ajar, revealing dark, empty spaces. The room felt abandoned, but also strangely frozen in time. It was as if someone had just up and left in a hurry. I moved cautiously, exploring the corners of the room. The spiral staircase was at the far side, leading up to a small, secluded study. It was isolated from the rest of the house, and the moment I stepped into it, I felt a strange coldness in the air. The room was filled with old books and papers, scattered across a large desk. A single chair sat in front of the desk, its leather worn. On the wall, an old painting hung crookedly. It was a picture of the mansion, but it looked nothing like the real thing. It was painted in a surreal, almost otherworldly style, and it made my skin crawl. I noticed an elevator off to the side of the room. It was a small, rusty thing, the kind you'd expect to find in an old building that hadn't been used in decades. I tried to open it, but the doors wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handles, but they were stuck tight. Something about the way it refused to open, felt unnerving. I spent maybe 15 minutes there, poking around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was a palpable silence in the room, a weight to the air that made it hard to breathe. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to just turn around and walk out. There was still so much to explore, but I knew the longer I stayed, the more dangerous it became. I'd already spent hours in the house, wandering in circles, losing track of time. The light outside had begun to dim, and the darkness inside the mansion was becoming oppressive. I made a decision. It was time to leave. I turned and began to retrace my steps, heading back toward the spiral staircase and the main entryway. But this time I felt different, more on edge. It was as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My footsteps echoed louder than before, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. When I reached the front door, I paused for a moment, listening. The faintest sound of footsteps outside broke the silence. I froze, pressing my back against the cold, crumbling walls of the mansion. My breath quickened. The door creaked open just as I heard voices approaching. I couldn't tell what was happening outside, but I didn't want to find out. My heart was pounding now, the adrenaline kicking in. I slipped back through the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. I hid behind a corner, crouching low to the ground. The door to the mansion creaked open fully. I could hear the crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway. The voices were getting closer. I couldn't see them yet, but I knew they were coming. My mind raced. The police, maybe? Had someone seen me? Was I in trouble? I waited, holding my breath, until I could no longer hear them outside. The silence that followed was deafening. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly crept toward the exit again, my senses heightened, every movement feeling like a trap. Just as I reached the door, I heard a shout from outside. "Hey, you there!" My heart skipped. I stepped out from my hiding place and raised my hands in surrender. The cops were already there. A couple of officers stood just outside, glancing at me. One of them spoke up, though I could barely hear him over the thudding of my heart. "Come on out. You're not supposed to be in there." I had no choice but to comply. I walked out slowly, my feet dragging, each step feeling heavier than the last. They searched me, asked me a few questions, found my pipe and grinder. I half expected to get arrested, but they didn't seem that interested in throwing me in jail. They told me not to come back. I just nodded. My legs were shaky, and I didn't trust myself to speak. As they turned to leave, one officer glanced at me and asked, Why'd you even come here? Wasn't worth it, was it? I shook my head. My mind was already far away, processing everything I had seen, everything I had felt in that place. The feeling that something was... It was my sophomore year at a small liberal arts college in the Appalachian foothills of northern Georgia, a place nestled between ridges and dotted with dense woods. My friends and I had gotten pretty familiar with the trails around campus, and though it was a quiet, rural area, the woods had an almost comforting feeling to them during the day. At night, however, it was a different story entirely. The forest, which seemed friendly and tame under the sun, morphed into something foreign and unpredictable once the stars came out. It wasn't a fear of the dark that bothered me. I had always been the adventurous type. I loved wandering off the beaten path. But something about these mountains, especially when you found yourself on a trail alone in the dead of night, felt different. The trees looked more like watchers than mere vegetation, and the shadows took on lives of their own, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Still, I had my pride, and I didn't feel like I'd let anything like that stop me. One night, the weather was perfect, that kind of crisp coolness in the air that felt both refreshing and alive. The full moon hung low and bright, casting the world in a soft, pale blue light. It was around 11 p.m., and most of my friends had opted for a quiet night in, cramming for exams or watching movies. I, on the other hand, had an itch for something different, something solitary, the kind of experience you could only get from a night hike, alone, deep into the forest, far from the reach of streetlights and civilization. I had been down this particular trail dozens of times before. It was easy, barely a mile loop, mostly flat with the occasional gentle incline. The woods here were quiet, peaceful even, and I figured it would be a simple walk under the moonlight. Maybe a little moment of solitude, a time to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight, even though I doubted I would need it. My phone? Forget about it. This was 2002, and back then, people didn't rely on their cell phones for everything. It wasn't like today, when you feel like you're lost without a screen in your hand. I was used to the woods, used to the feeling of being alone out here, and I felt confident I could handle it. I set off down the path, walking in the moonlight. The air smelled like pine, rich and earthy, mixed with that faint hint of damp soil from the recent rain. The trail wound between trees that stretched their limbs high into the sky, their branches thick and tangled. As I walked, the only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful at first, too peaceful, in fact, the kind of quiet that made everything else seem unnaturally loud, like the forest was holding its breath. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I first started to feel something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything overt, just a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension that seemed to press in on me. I brushed it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. The forest had a way of making you second-guess yourself. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I heard it. A sound that was out of place, out of sync with everything around me. At first, it was so faint that I thought it might be an animal. Maybe a bird in the distance or some small critter moving through the underbrush. But no, it was too human, too distinct. A man's voice. At first, I thought maybe someone else was out here, just as foolishly wandering as I was. But then I realized something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't like someone talking. It wasn't even a call for help, as I initially thought. It was crying, quiet at first, almost distant, like a soft, broken sob. And then it grew louder, more jagged, filled with an odd, desperate tone that made my stomach twist. I stopped dead in my tracks. My body immediately tensed, and my mind started running through all the possible explanations. There had to be someone out here, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost, maybe someone had fallen and gotten hurt. The thought of helping someone, of offering some kind of support, was the first thing that came to mind, but something else was telling me to stay still. It was an instinctual warning, deep in my gut. The crying continued, but now it was more intense. It wasn't just a sob. It was something worse. There was a kind of incoherence to it, as if the person crying wasn't fully in control of themselves. They were babbling, murmuring something beneath the sobs, but I couldn't make out the words. They were distant, coming from somewhere to the right of the trail, deeper into the woods. A small part of me wanted to shout out, to call to them, but I couldn't. Something in me froze. It was like my body was telling me to stay silent, to stay hidden. As the crying continued, I started to feel sick. A deep, tight knot of unease settled in my stomach, and my limbs began to feel heavier. There was no sense of logic to it. The thought of a person crying out in the woods should have been a call to action. But instead, I felt paralyzed. The rational part of my brain tried to talk me down. Asterisk, maybe it's just some guy who's had too much to drink, maybe it's nothing, asterisk. But the part of me that listened to instinct knew something was very wrong. The crying wasn't just sad anymore. It was desperate. There was a kind of shrillness to it, something raw and unhinged that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the kind of sobbing you hear when someone's grieving. This was more like the sobs of someone who had lost their mind, someone who was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. Felt wrong deep in my bones. The longer I stood there, the more I realized how close the sound was getting. The trees around me seemed to close in, the shadows heavier now, like the forest itself was pressing in on me. I couldn't see the source of the sound, couldn't tell if it was some poor soul lost and suffering or something else entirely. My mind kept spiraling, feeding on the fear, but I tried to focus. I wasn't about to let panic get the best of me. Not out here, in the dark. The crying was louder now, more frantic. I felt a sharp pang of panic in my chest, and my heart began to race. This wasn't right. It didn't matter if someone needed help. Something told me I needed to get out of here. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't safe. I slowly turned around, trying to move as quietly as possible, but it was hard to stop my pulse from thumping in my ears. Every step felt like it was echoing through the woods. I began to retrace my steps, walking faster now, though I still tried to be quiet. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and every step felt like a countdown. The crying continued, but now it seemed to be following me, as if it was getting closer, or maybe I was getting closer to it. The sound wrapped itself around me like a vice, the shrillness of it crawling up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the trees. The air felt thick, oppressive, and my skin tingled with the sense that something was watching me. My mind raced. Was there someone out there? A wild person, a hermit living in these woods, deranged and waiting for someone to stumble into his trap? I shook the thought away, but it clung to me, whispering in the back of my mind. I kept my head down, focusing on the ground, counting my steps. Finally, the crying began to fade. At first, I thought it was just my own fear clouding my hearing, but then I realized I was moving farther away from it. My pace quickened, and my mind raced to find any logical explanation. But none came. The further I walked, the quieter the sound became, until it was almost gone, replaced by the normal, eerie stillness of the woods. The crunch of my boots on the dirt was the loudest thing in the world. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was nearly running, my body coiled tight with adrenaline. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, hands trembling as I unlocked the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors with a frantic sense of finality. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to collect myself. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through my veins like an electric current. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I had narrowly avoided something bad, very bad. I didn't feel guilty, not at all. I had done the right thing by leaving, by not engaging. I couldn't explain why, but deep down I knew that whatever was out there, that crying, that frantic, broken sobbing, wasn't a person in need of help. It was something else, something I didn't want to understand. I drove back to campus in silence, my mind whirling with what I had just experienced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching, waiting, and I couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I had been a little less cautious, if I had shown my flashlight just once, if I had called out. But maybe it was better not knowing. Maybe it was better that way. It was a Tuesday, and the clock on the wall of the small convenience store Where I worked had just clicked past 11 p.m. My shift had been longer than usual, covering for a coworker who called in sick. I was used to getting off at 7, so walking home in the dark after such a long day felt a little off. But it wasn't unfamiliar, this was my routine, just a different hour. The town was small, the roads empty, and I always felt safe walking through the quiet streets. It was peaceful at night. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, dim shadows on the sidewalks. My house was about a 20-minute walk from the store. There was a trail that ran behind a row of houses, cutting through some trees, and passed by the train tracks. I liked it because it kept me off the main roads and away from the occasional cars speeding by. It was quiet, and the trees made the air smell fresh, even at night. The trail would lead me to a neighborhood and eventually to my street, but I always took it. It felt more like a shortcut, but also like a calm escape from the streets I had to walk earlier in the day. Tonight, the path seemed different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavy, and the shadows from the trees looked darker, more stretched out than they usually did. Maybe it was because I was more tired than usual or just a product of the day having been longer than expected. Either way, I didn't think too much about it. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound in the air, broken only by the distant hum of cars on the road. There were no sounds of animals, no chirping of insects, no wind in the leaves like usual. It was just eerily quiet. I rounded a bend in the trail, coming to a small clearing, where I could see the train tracks just ahead. As I approached, I noticed something on the ground near the tracks. At first, I thought it was just someone's discarded belongings, but then I saw movement. A figure was sprawled out next to a bicycle, their backs slightly arched, and they were moaning. The sound wasn't natural, though. It wasn't the kind of moan you make when you're hurt. It sounded forced, almost fake, like a child trying to get out of school by pretending to be sick. I slowed down. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't a paramedic, and there was no one else around. The figure was lying with his face turned away from me, his body limp but twitching in small, uncoordinated motions. His bike stood upright on its kickstand beside him, not knocked over as you would expect if someone had really fallen. It didn't add up. "Help! Please!" the man called out weakly. The tone of his voice didn't sit right with me. It didn't sound like someone in real distress. It was too calm, too controlled. I was skeptical, and as I took a step back to reconsider, he called out again. "Please help me. I'm hurt. I can't move." His voice wavered, but it still felt fake. I stood still for a second, scanning the area, my eyes darting around the trees and along the trail. There were no signs of anyone else nearby. It was just the two of us, and I didn't know what to think. Something about the whole situation felt off. My gut told me something wasn't right, and I decided to keep walking. I turned around, my feet still crunching the gravel beneath me. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I tried to calm myself. There was nothing that was really wrong, was there? He was just some guy on the ground. Maybe he was drunk or hurt and just needed help. But I wasn't in the mood to get involved. It wasn't my problem. Just as I reached the incline leading toward the railroad tracks, the man suddenly lurched to life. I heard the sound of him scrambling against the gravel, then the unmistakable sound of his feet hitting the ground, his weight shifting as he stood up quickly. "You motherfucker!" he yelled, his voice turning from a feigned whimper to pure anger. "I'm gonna kill you." I froze. The words echoed through the trees, and something about the aggression in his voice made my stomach drop. I looked over my shoulder, just in time to see the man pushing himself up onto his bike, his legs shaking slightly as he steadied himself. In that moment, everything in me screamed to run. Without thinking, I took off. My legs were already moving before I even had time to process the full danger of the situation. The adrenaline hit me hard, and my pace quickened as I climbed the steep incline toward the train tracks. My heart was pounding, my chest burning as I pushed myself harder, faster, willing myself to put more distance between me and the man behind me. I glanced back briefly and saw the man gaining ground, his bike wobbling as he rode after me. My lungs burned with the cold night air as I climbed the incline. I was almost to the tracks, and I could hear him yelling behind me, but I didn't dare look back again. The noise was too loud, too threatening. I made it to the top just in time to hear the screech of the man's bike hitting the metal tracks. His front tire hit a rail with a sharp jolt, and I watched as he was thrown forward, flipping over the handlebars and slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. For a split second, everything was silent except for the sound of his body hitting the earth. Then came the genuine moans of pain. I didn't stop. My legs pushed forward, and I kept my eyes ahead, not daring to look back at the mess behind me. I didn't care what happened to him. I didn't care if he was hurt or if he was playing a game. I just needed to get out of there. The sound of his muffled calls for help faded behind me, blending with the night as I made my way over the tracks. I took the next turn off the path and headed toward the gas station up ahead, a small, glowing beacon in the distance. I'll never forget that trip. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. The fear that we all felt that night, the sense of vulnerability, it hasn't left me. The experience still haunts me, makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It wasn't just a bad experience. It was an encounter that changed how I view safety and trust. It was a wake-up call, and I'll never forget what happened when we went camping out in the middle of nowhere, far away from the comforts of civilization. The vast open spaces of Colorado's BLM land should have felt like freedom, but instead, they felt like a trap. It was early September. The air was crisp, and the weather had been perfect for a camping trip. There were 5 of us, 4 friends and me. We decided to escape the hustle of city life for the weekend and head out for some real solitude. We piled into 3 cars, all packed with camping gear, enough food to last us the entire weekend, and a sense of excitement. Our destination was a stretch of public land south of Gypsum, Colorado, a place I'd camped before. Quiet, remote, a perfect place for people who want to get away from it all. We'd driven an hour and a half down a narrow Forest Service road, winding deeper into the wilderness, until the world felt like it had disappeared. No phone signal, no one around for miles, nothing but the sound of tires on gravel, the rustle of trees in the wind, and the occasional bird call. You could see the headlights of other cars from miles away, but nothing passed us by. We were truly alone out there. We parked our cars about 30 yards from a clearing where we set up our camp, a nice open spot near a small creek that bubbled over smooth rocks. The fire pit was pre-made, the wood stacked neatly, and the smell of pine filled the air. We set up the tents, and the fire crackled as we started preparing dinner. The guys John, Steve, and Marcus did most of the cooking. I wasn't too great with food over an open fire, so I mostly helped with getting water and setting things up. By the time the sun was setting, the camp was buzzing with chatter and laughter. We had the typical camping meal, hot dogs, baked beans, and s'mores. Afterward, we cleaned up, put everything away, and started to settle in. We were all pretty tired, so the plan was to head back to the cars for a quick break before retreating to our tents for the night. I remember the crisp evening air as we made our way back to the cars. The moon was barely out, and the sky had started to darken, painting the forest in shades of gray. As we walked over the gravel, I could hear the faintest noise, just the wind whispering through the trees. But then, something else caught my attention, a strange feeling, an instinct that told me something was off. I wasn't the only one who felt it. As we reached the cars, we stopped dead in our tracks. There was a sense of stillness in the air, like something was out of place. At first, we all just stood there looking around, but then we saw it. The tires. 3 cars parked side by side all had the same thing. The front right tires of each car were slashed. Clean, precise slashes along the sidewalls. The cuts were identical, as if whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. I stood there, my heart sinking into my stomach. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Who would do something like that? Why would someone come all the way out here just to destroy our tires? My mind raced. First, we thought maybe it was a prank. I mean, it didn't make sense for anyone to be out here. But the more I looked at the cuts, the more I realized this wasn't a joke. It was intentional. It was calculated. Everyone was silent for a moment. The air was thick with the realization that this wasn't something we could just laugh off. We all started to check the other cars, but there was no doubt. The tires were ruined. It was as if someone had waited for us to walk away and then did this while we weren't looking. But how had they done it? The cars were parked a good distance from the fire. We would have heard any noise, right? We tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was out there. Maybe they were just passing through, maybe they were just assholes. But nothing made sense. We didn't even hear a car on the road. No one had passed by, and the road was too narrow for someone to just sneak up on us. The reality of the situation set in. We were isolated. There were no other cars out here. We had no cell service. The closest ranger station was miles away, and even if we called the cops, they wouldn't be able to do anything in time. We were on our own. Panic started to set in. The kind of panic you don't expect until you find yourself deep in a situation that feels entirely out of your control. We all went quiet, staring at the tires, trying to process what was happening. John, ever the level-headed one, broke the silence. "We need to get out of here, now." His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge in it. The fear. It was in all of us now. We had 3 spare tires. No one had a jack for more than one car, but we managed to rig it so we could change all 3 tires. I remember the tightness in my chest as we worked. My hands were shaking, not from the cold but from something else. Something darker, something that told me we weren't just dealing with a flat tire. We were dealing with something much more sinister. And then there was Marcus standing watch. He had a gun. He was always the one to carry one when we went camping, for just this kind of situation. He stood by the cars, scanning the woods with his eyes darting back and forth. His fingers never strayed far from his weapon. The whole time, it felt like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the tree line, waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for us to be vulnerable. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but it was there, suffocating. The longer we stayed, the more oppressive it became. Once we finally got the spare tires on, we didn't waste any time. We piled into the cars, and Marcus led the way, gun still in hand, eyes constantly shifting to the trees. We didn't look back. We didn't stop to pack anything else. We just got in and drove. I'll never forget that drive. The way the headlights cut through the dark, and how the road seemed endless. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, miles away from the campsite. When we finally made it to a spot with service, we called the cops. They told us they'd send someone out, but honestly, I knew they wouldn't be able to do anything. They couldn't prove anything. They couldn't track anyone down. But the worst part of the whole experience, the knowledge that someone had been out there, that someone had been watching us. They knew exactly where we were. They knew exactly what they were doing, and we never saw them. That feeling has stayed with me ever since. That paranoia, the sense that someone is out there, waiting, watching. It's a kind of fear I never fully understood before that trip. It's not the fear of the unknown, not the fear of nature. It's the fear of a person who can be anywhere, who can blend into the trees, who can make you feel like prey without you even knowing it. And what's worse is that I know we'll never know who they were. They'll never be caught. They'll never be brought to justice. The worst thing about it all was that we weren't even that far from help. We were only a few hours from town. But in the middle of the night, on that desolate road, it felt like the world was miles away. I still think about it sometimes, even now, years later. The silence of that night, the fear that crawled under my skin and into my bones, the feeling of being completely alone, even though there were 8 of us there. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never go back to that part of the wilderness again. Not alone, not with friends, not ever. There's a part of me that wishes I could forget, but there's another part of me that knows I can't. Because that night, we weren't just camped out in the middle of nowhere. We were surrounded by someone who knew exactly how to make us feel powerless. And that's what I'll never forget. It was late spring, the kind of late spring where the evenings stretched out longer than they should, and the air felt heavy with the scent of pine and earth. I'd always enjoyed the woods that spread out around the outskirts of town, those vast stretches of trees and trails that few people ventured into. People talked about how the woods were spooky or unsettling. But for me, they were just home, a place where I could lose myself. No one ever bothered me out there. I'd go for hours, sometimes days, without seeing a soul. That evening was no different. I had started my hike around 10 p.m., leaving the familiar edges of town behind. The streetlights grew faint and the noise of the cars and houses was replaced with the hum of nature. My feet crunched along the dirt path, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot sounded like thunder in the otherwise silent night. The air was cool against my skin, but not so cold that it felt uncomfortable. I was accustomed to being out here at night. In fact, I preferred it. It gave me a sense of freedom, a quiet space to think. I didn't have a clear destination in mind that night. Sometimes, I would wander aimlessly, finding new spots to sit and clear my head. The sound of the wind through the trees was calming, and as I walked deeper into the woods, the town lights began to fade, swallowed by the thick canopy of leaves overhead. The path was faint now, more of an old trail that had long since been overtaken by the forest. Yet, I had walked it enough to know where I was going. By midnight, I was deeper into the woods than I'd planned to be. The stars above were barely visible through the branches, but the moonlight filtered through just enough to cast an eerie glow across the forest floor. There were no other hikers out that late, no campers, just me and the quiet woods. Then I saw it. At first, it didn't make sense. There, just off the trail, was a clearing. In the middle of it was a group of shacks, if you could even call them that. They were simple, crude structures, made of scrap metal, old sheets, and sticks, haphazardly piled together in a way that seemed intentional but chaotic. It looked like something you'd find in the remains of a forgotten village, except this was in the middle of nowhere. The fire pit was the most peculiar part. It was made out of an old tire, half buried in the ground. The fire was still burning, small but steady, the embers glowing red in the center. The smoke drifted lazily into the night air, and for a moment, I thought someone must still be nearby. I waited for the sound of voices or the crackle of footsteps, but there was nothing. The woods were as quiet as the grave. I stood there for a long time, staring at the fire. It didn't make sense. Who would build this place in the middle of the woods and just leave it? The fire had been tended. It was too warm to have gone out on its own. But there was no sign of life, no movement, no voices, nothing to suggest anyone had been around recently. The whole thing felt wrong, like an abandoned campsite, but too permanent. The sheets flapped gently in the breeze, but they were still almost unnaturally so, like the place had been frozen in time. Curiosity tugged at me, but there was an unease in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to leave. I should have left, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I took a few cautious steps closer, the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves the only sound breaking the silence. The closer I got, the more details emerged. Each shack was barely put together. Some were just piles of scrap metal leaning against tree trunks, others were makeshift tents, and a few looked like they might have once been actual homes, though long abandoned. There were no tools scattered about, no personal belongings. Just the fire pit and what appeared to be a collection of discarded clothes, old blankets, and remnants of food. Felt abandoned, but not in a natural way. This didn't look like a place people had moved away from. It looked like something had forced them to leave. I stepped around the fire pit, my heart pounding now. The ashes were still warm, and the air around the fire had a faint smell of burnt wood. I crouched down beside it, and for a split second, I almost expected someone to leap out from the shadows and yell at me to leave. But no one did. The fire flickered on, and I leaned in closer, half expecting to find something hidden in the embers. But there was nothing. I slowly stood up and took a step back. Something felt terribly off. The woods had always been quiet, but this silence was different. It was oppressive, as if the very air held its breath. I glanced around again. There was no sign of anyone. No tracks on the ground, no sounds of life, not even the sound of wildlife that you would expect in a place like this. I walked deeper into the clearing, inspecting the shanties. One had a makeshift door, but it was hanging off its hinges, twisted and bent. I could see inside. A few blankets thrown carelessly on the floor, but nothing else. It was empty. The next one was slightly more intact, but the walls were sagging and torn, and it looked as if the wind might blow it over at any moment. The third structure had a small pile of belongings beside it. A rusted canister of what looked like old gasoline, an empty bottle of water, and a few old, tattered jackets. No one had been here for a long time. I turned back to the fire pit. It was the only thing that didn't make sense. It was alive. Someone had set it, tended to it, and left it burning. But why? The fire was now the only thing tying me to this strange place, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt a sense of dread creeping in. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had no idea why these shacks were here, or what had happened to the people who had left them. But something in me said it was time to go. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the trees around me, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree and confront me. But there was no one. The silence was unbearable. I began to walk away, my pace quickening as I neared the trail again. The fire behind me flickered in my peripheral vision, but I dared not look back. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the trail as I walked, the darkness swallowing up the woods around me. I felt my chest tighten with each step, the sense of unease gnawing at me. Something wasn't right about the whole situation, and it only took me until I was nearly back at the edge of the forest to realize what it was. I had walked in a circle. The clearing, the shanties, the fire pit, they were all back in front of me again. I blinked, confused. I had been walking in a straight line. I knew I had, yet somehow I was back where I started. It didn't make sense. I had been sure of my direction, but here I was, the same shack standing in the same place, the fire still burning like it hadn't moved an inch. Panic set in. This wasn't just the woods anymore. This wasn't something I could explain away. The clearing hadn't shifted. It was the same one I'd seen earlier, but there was no other way I could have come back. I was lost, but how? I wasn't a rookie in the woods. I knew these trails. I knew the landmarks, but nothing was familiar anymore. The air felt heavier, suffocating, and the fire still burned in the distance, its glow casting an unnatural light across the trees. Couldn't stay there, but my legs wouldn't move. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. My heart raced. I turned to leave once more, but something caught my eye, movement. In the corner of my vision, behind the last shack, I saw something shift. A figure, then another. People. They were standing there, half visible in the shadow, staring at me. My blood ran cold, but they weren't moving. They just stood there, frozen. I didn't wait to find out if they would. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like an eternity. The trees blurred by, the path no longer familiar. It was like the woods were playing tricks on me, twisting and shifting. The further I ran, the more it felt like the trees were closing in. The silence was deafening, and the deeper I went, the less I could hear myself breathe. When I finally stumbled back into town, it was still dark. The streetlights seemed almost comforting. I didn't stop running until I reached my front door, slamming it shut behind me. My heart still pounded, my chest tight with fear. I tried to make sense of what happened out there, but the more I thought about it, the less I could explain. There was no logical explanation for the shanty town in the woods, or the fire that never went out, or the people who had stood there in the shadows, watching me. The only thing I knew for certain was that I would never go back. Some things in the woods are meant to be left alone.